Tonight, we travel to a place that sits at the edge of the known world, an island in the North Atlantic, just below the Arctic Circle, where the Earth is still being made, where volcanoes erupt beneath glaciers, sending rivers of meltwater surging across black sand plains, where the ground breathes steam in the dead of winter, and the sky, on the right night, comes alive with curtains of green and violet light. This is Iceland, a small island in an enormous sea, a place of contradictions, fire and ice, darkness and blinding light, isolation and warmth, ancient tradition and startling modernity, a country of roughly 380,000 people living on an island about the size of Kentucky or Portugal, a place where the phone book is organized by first name, where most of the population lives in a single city, and where the landscape looks like the surface of another planet. It is one of the youngest land masses on Earth. Geologically speaking, Iceland is still a teenager. The forces that built it have not finished their work. The island cracks, shifts, steams, and erupts. It grows. Even now, as you listen to this, somewhere beneath the ice and rock, magma is moving. But there is another side to Iceland. Beyond the fire and the geological drama, there is a stillness here, a quiet, patient calm that is increasingly hard to find anywhere else on Earth. Vast, empty highlands where no one lives. Fjords so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat echoing off the water. Tiny fishing villages nestled at the end of long inlets, where the rhythm of daily life has barely changed in centuries, where the boat goes out with the morning and comes back with the tide. There is a word in Icelandic, "þetta reddast," that roughly translates as, "it will all work out." It is something close to a national motto, not optimism exactly, but something deeper, a quiet confidence, born of centuries of survival, that whatever comes, the people will find a way through. The volcano will erupt, and the village will rebuild. The winter will be long, and the light will return. The glacier will retreat, and the land will adjust. Þetta reddast. It will work out. So settle in, let the world outside grow quiet, and let the atlas carry you to this extraordinary island at the top of the world. The shape of the island. To understand Iceland, you must first understand where it sits and why it exists at all. Open a map of the North Atlantic Ocean. Find the space between Norway and Greenland, roughly halfway between Europe and North America. There, sitting alone in a vast expanse of cold sea, is Iceland. It lies just south of the Arctic Circle, the northernmost point of the island. A small rocky outcrop called Grimsey actually touches the circle itself. Iceland is isolated. Its nearest neighbor is Greenland, about 300 kilometers to the northwest, but Greenland's eastern coast is largely uninhabited ice sheet, so in practical terms, Iceland's nearest populated neighbor is the Faroe Islands, roughly 450 kilometers to the southeast. Scotland lies about 800 kilometers to the south. Norway, the ancestral homeland of many Icelanders, is nearly 1,000 kilometers to the east. This isolation has shaped everything about Iceland. Its culture, its language, its self-reliance, its sense of identity. For most of its history, getting to Iceland meant days of sailing across some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The country developed in relative seclusion, preserving traditions and a way of speaking that the rest of Scandinavia gradually left behind. The island itself is roughly 103,000 square kilometers. If you were to look down on it from above, you would see a shape that is almost rectangular, but deeply cut and carved along its edges, fjords biting into the northwest and east, peninsulas reaching out into the sea like fingers, bays and inlets creating a coastline that, if you stretched it out flat, would run for nearly 5,000 kilometers. The interior of the island is a different world from the coast. Most of the population, the overwhelming majority, lives along the southwestern coast and the coastal lowlands that ring the island. The interior, known as the Highlands, is largely uninhabited. It is a vast, empty plateau of lava fields, glacial rivers, and volcanic desert, terrain so barren and otherworldly that NASA once sent astronauts here to train for the moon landings. There are no trees in the highlands, no villages, no roads for much of the year. It is one of the last true wildernesses in Europe, and crossing it, even today, requires serious preparation and the right vehicle. In winter, the highland roads close entirely, and the interior becomes as inaccessible as it was 1,000 years ago. The reason Iceland exists at all comes down to geology. The island sits directly on top of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the underwater mountain range that runs down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, marking the boundary where the North American tectonic plate and the Eurasian tectonic plate are pulling apart. This is not a metaphor. The plates are literally moving away from each other at a rate of about 2 centimeters per year, and as they pull apart, magma from deep within the earth rises up to fill the gap, creating new rock, new land. Iceland is the place where this process breaks the surface of the ocean. The island is, in the most literal sense, a piece of the ocean floor that grew tall enough to become land. You can see this with your own eyes at a place called Thingvellir, a broad, flat valley in southwestern Iceland where the rift between the two plates is visible as a series of dramatic fissures and cliffs. Standing in that valley, you are standing in the gap between two continents. The cliff face to your west is the edge of the North American plate. The rocks to your east are the beginning of Europe. Nowhere else on Earth can you stand on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge above sea level and see the plates pulling apart in front of you. It is one of those places where the immense forces that shape our planet become suddenly, startlingly visible. But tectonic plates are only part of the story. The other force that shaped Iceland is a geological feature called a hot spot, a plume of unusually hot mantle material that rises from deep within the Earth, independent of plate boundaries. Iceland sits on top of one of these hotspots, which is why it has so much more volcanic activity than other points along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The combination of the ridge and the hotspot is what makes Iceland so geologically extraordinary. It is not just splitting apart, it is also being pushed up from below by an enormous column of heat. The result is an island that is one of the most volcanically active places on the planet, with eruptions occurring, on average, every 4 to 5 years. This geological restlessness has given Iceland a landscape unlike anywhere else. The island is essentially built from layer upon layer of cooled lava, ash, and volcanic rock shaped by ice, wind, and water over hundreds of thousands of years. The oldest rocks on the island are only about 16 million years old, which sounds ancient until you compare it to the rocks of Scotland or Greenland, which are billions of years old. Iceland, in geological terms, was born yesterday, and the building continues. In the Reykjanes Peninsula, in the southwest corner of the island, the rift between the tectonic plates is visible as a series of fissures, ridges, and lava fields that look raw and unfinished, because they are. The lava here is young, some of it cooled only centuries ago. Walking across it, you can see the shapes left by the flowing rock as it solidified. Ropey textures, sharp ridges, collapsed tubes, and hollows where gas bubbles once pressed against the cooling surface. The Reykjanes Peninsula also hosts the famous Blue Lagoon, a milky blue geothermal pool that has become one of Iceland's most visited tourist attractions. But the lagoon is not natural. It is the runoff from the nearby Svartsengi geothermal power plant, mineral-rich water that collects in a lava field and happens to be the perfect temperature for bathing. The silica and minerals in the water give it its distinctive color and are said to be good for the skin. Whether you find the Blue Lagoon magical or overly commercialized depends largely on your temperament and how you feel about paying a significant entrance fee to sit in a power plant's runoff. Either way, the water is warm, the steam is thick, and on a cold day, the experience of soaking in hot, milky blue water while snow falls on your head is genuinely memorable. Beyond the rift zones and the volcanic systems, Iceland's terrain is shaped by a force that is less dramatic but equally powerful: erosion. The combination of wind, rain, frost, and the grinding action of glaciers has sculpted the volcanic rock into forms of astonishing variety. There are canyons, Deep, narrow gorges carved by glacial rivers rushing with meltwater. There are table mountains, flat-topped peaks called tuyas, formed when volcanoes erupted beneath glaciers during the ice ages, the flat top marking the surface of the ice sheet that once covered the island. There are lava fields that stretch for kilometers, their surfaces buckled and twisted into shapes that look organic, almost biological, like the skin of some enormous sleeping creature. There are pseudo-craters, circular depressions formed not by volcanic eruption but by steam explosions when hot lava flowed over wet ground. And there are sand deserts. Yes, deserts in Iceland, vast expanses of black volcanic sand in the interior highlands where rainfall is low, vegetation is absent, and the wind sculpts the sand into dunes that would not look out of place in the Sahara, except for the fact that they are jet black and surrounded by glaciers. The climate of Iceland is milder than most people expect, thanks to the Gulf Stream, that great river of warm water that flows across the Atlantic from the Caribbean. Iceland's coastal temperatures are far more moderate than its latitude would suggest. Reykjavik, the capital, sits at roughly the same latitude as Fairbanks, Alaska, but its average January temperature hovers around freezing, about -1 degree Celsius. Fairbanks, by comparison, averages -23 in January. Summers in Iceland are cool but surprisingly bright. July temperatures in Reykjavik average around 12 degrees Celsius, pleasant enough for a light jacket, cool enough for the grass to stay impossibly green. The growing season is short but intense, and during the long days of summer, when the sun barely sets, the landscape transforms into a palette of vivid greens, soft yellows, and the deep blue of sky reflected in still water. Winter is another matter. Not because of extreme cold, Iceland rarely sees the brutal temperatures of continental Scandinavia or Canada, but because of the darkness, the wind, and the storms. From November through January, daylight in Reykjavik shrinks to just 4 or 5 hours. The storms that sweep across the North Atlantic hit Iceland with full force, bringing horizontal rain, driving snow, and winds that can knock a person off their feet. Icelanders have a saying, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. The island's weather is famously unpredictable, changing from sunshine to hail to fog to sunshine again in the space of an hour. This is partly because Iceland sits at the meeting point of cold Arctic air masses from the north and warm Atlantic air from the south. When those two systems collide over the island, the result is weather that refuses to make up its mind. Despite its dramatic landscape, Iceland is one of the most sparsely populated countries in Europe. About 2/3 of the population, roughly 240,000 people, live in the greater Reykjavik area, on the southwestern coast. The rest are scattered in small towns, fishing villages, and isolated farms around the island's perimeter. The north is anchored by Akureyri, Iceland's second largest town, with a population of roughly 19,000. It sits at the head of a long fjord called Eyjafjörður and serves as the cultural and economic center of the north, a small, charming place with a surprisingly vibrant art scene and a botanical garden that defies the subarctic latitude. The east is the most remote part of inhabited Iceland, a region of deep fjords, tiny fishing villages, and long stretches of empty coast. The West Fjords, a large peninsula jutting out from the northwest corner of the island, are even more isolated. Roads there are narrow, often unpaved, and in winter, entire sections can be cut off by snow for weeks at a time. And yet, people live there. They have always lived there, farming, fishing, enduring. The story of Iceland is, in many ways, the story of people choosing to stay in a place that does not make it easy. Fire, volcanoes, and geothermal wonders beneath the quiet surface of Iceland. The Earth is alive. There are roughly 130 volcanic mountains on the island, of which about 30 are considered active. And when geologists say active in Iceland, they do not mean dormant volcanoes that might theoretically erupt someday. They mean volcanoes that have erupted within recorded history, volcanoes that are monitored daily, volcanoes that remind Icelanders regularly that they are living on a land that is still being formed. The most famous eruption in Iceland's history and one of the most consequential volcanic events in modern world history occurred in 1783 when a fissure called Laki opened in the southern highlands. Over the course of 8 months, Laki poured out an estimated 14 cubic kilometers of basaltic lava, the largest lava flow in recorded history. But it was not the lava that caused the catastrophe, it was the gas. The eruption released massive quantities of sulfur dioxide and hydrofluoric acid into the atmosphere. A poisonous haze, known in Iceland as the Moduhordindin, the mist hardships, settled over the island and spread across Europe. In Iceland, the consequences were devastating. The fluorine-laden ash poisoned the grass, and the livestock that ate it died. Over the following 2 years, roughly half of Iceland's cattle, 80% of its sheep, and a quarter of its human population perished from famine and disease. It was the darkest chapter in Iceland's history since the Black Death, but the effects reached far beyond Iceland. The sulfuric haze drifted across Europe, dimming the sun and dropping temperatures. Crop failures followed. Some historians have drawn a line, debated but compelling, between the Laki eruption and the social unrest that contributed to the French Revolution 6 years later. A volcanic fissure in a remote corner of the North Atlantic, it is argued, helped reshape the political map of Europe. In more recent memory, Iceland reminded the world of its volcanic nature in the spring of 2010, when a volcano beneath the Eyjafjallajökull glacier erupted. The eruption itself was relatively modest by Icelandic standards, but the ash cloud it produced drifted southeast across the busy air corridors of northern Europe, grounding flights across the continent for nearly a week. Over 100,000 flights were cancelled. Millions of travelers were stranded. The economic disruption ran into billions of dollars. For most of the world, Eyjafjallajökull was an unexpected disruption and, for newsreaders, an impossible word to pronounce. For Icelanders, it was simply another eruption, inconvenient, worth monitoring, but hardly surprising. The volcano's much larger neighbor, Katla, had been rumbling ominously for years, and most Icelandic geologists considered Katla the real threat. As of tonight, Katla has not erupted since 1918, making it overdue by historical standards. When it does, the eruption is expected to be significantly larger than Eyjafjallajökull. Between 2021 and 2023, a series of eruptions on the Reykjanes Peninsula, just a short drive from Reykjavik and the international airport, brought volcanic tourism to a new level. The Fagradalsfjall eruptions were the kind that geologists dream of, relatively safe to observe, visually spectacular, and located in an area accessible by a moderate hike from the nearest road. Thousands of Icelanders and tourists trekked across lava fields to watch the eruptions up close. They sat on hillsides, eating packed lunches, while rivers of glowing lava pooled and flowed in the valley below. It was a reminder that in Iceland, the relationship between people and volcanoes is not one of fear alone. There is also fascination, respect, and a kind of familiarity. Icelanders know their volcanoes the way farmers know their fields, intimately, watchfully, and with an understanding that the land gives and the land takes. The volcanic energy that powers Iceland's eruptions also produces one of the island's most distinctive features, its geothermal activity. The earth here is warm just below the surface. In many places, you need only dig a meter or two before the temperature begins to rise. This heat manifests in hundreds of hot springs, steam vents, fumaroles, and mud pots scattered across the island. The most famous geothermal site in Iceland, and the one that gave its name to all similar phenomena around the world, is Geysir. Located in the Haukadalur Valley in southern Iceland, Geysir is the original geyser. The English word geyser comes directly from the Icelandic name of this particular hot spring, which in turn comes from the Icelandic verb geisa, meaning to gush. Geysir itself has become somewhat unpredictable in recent decades, erupting only rarely, but its neighbor, Strókar, the churn, erupts faithfully every 6 to 10 minutes, sending a column of boiling water 15 to 20 meters into the cold air. If you stand nearby, You can watch the surface of the pool swell into a pale blue dome just before the eruption, a moment of perfect tension before the water explodes upward and falls back as steam. Iceland has turned its volcanic inheritance into a remarkable practical advantage. Nearly 90% of Icelandic homes are heated by geothermal energy, hot water piped directly from the earth. The country generates virtually all of its electricity from renewable sources, about 70% from hydroelectric dams and 30% from geothermal power plants. The hot water that flows from Icelandic taps carries a faint scent of sulfur, the smell of rotten eggs. To the uninitiated, Icelanders are so accustomed to it that they barely notice. Visitors, however, often comment on it when they first turn on a shower. The water is clean and safe, the sulfur content is harmless, but the smell takes some getting used to. This abundant geothermal energy has shaped Icelandic life in ways large and small. Reykjavik's sidewalks are heated from below to prevent ice buildup in winter. Greenhouses warmed by geothermal water grow tomatoes, cucumbers, and even bananas. On an island just below the Arctic Circle. Public swimming pools, heated by natural hot water, are found in nearly every town, no matter how small. They are not luxuries. They are the social heart of Icelandic communities, places where neighbors meet, gossip, and soak in water that the earth warmed for free. One of the most striking geothermal areas in Iceland is Namaskath, near Lake Mývatn in the north. Here, the earth is torn open. Mud pots bubble and belch in shades of gray and brown. Steam hisses from fissures in rock stained yellow and white by sulfur deposits. The ground itself is warm underfoot. In some spots, dangerously so. The air smells of sulfur and minerals, and the landscape looks less like Earth and more like the surface of Io, one of Jupiter's volcanic moons. There is something both unsettling and mesmerizing about these places. The Earth, which we are taught from childhood is solid and stable, reveals itself here as neither. It is thin, it is hot, it is alive with forces that we can feel but not control. Standing in a geothermal field in Iceland, listening to the hiss and gurgle of the earth, you are reminded that the planet we live on is not a finished thing. It is a work in progress. Among Iceland's volcanoes, Hekla holds a special place in both geological and cultural history. Located in the southern part of the island, Hekla has erupted over 20 times since the settlement of Iceland, making it one of the most active volcanoes in the country. In medieval Europe, Hekla was believed to be one of the gateways to hell. Monks in continental monasteries wrote of its fire and brimstone, and travelers' accounts described it as a place where damned souls could be heard screaming amid the explosions. The reality, while less theologically dramatic, is impressive enough. Hekla's eruptions are unpredictable in both timing and character. Some have been explosive, hurling ash high into the atmosphere. Others have been effusive, producing long lava flows that spread across the surrounding countryside. The volcano gives almost no warning before an eruption, sometimes as little as 30 minutes of seismic activity before the first explosion. This unpredictability makes Hekla one of the most closely monitored volcanoes in Iceland, though even modern instruments cannot guarantee advance notice. In the highlands, far from any road or settlement, the Askja caldera offers one of Iceland's most otherworldly landscapes. Askja is a large volcanic crater, a collapsed magma chamber that fills much of a highland plateau. Within the caldera lies Öskjuvatn, one of Iceland's deepest lakes. Its waters are dark and ominous blue. Beside it, a smaller crater called Viti, the Icelandic word for hell, holds a pool of warm, milky blue geothermal water in which hardy visitors can swim, though the descent into the crater is steep and the weather at this elevation can turn dangerous with little warning. Askja was the site of a catastrophic eruption in 1875 that drove a wave of Icelandic emigration to North America. The eruption deposited a thick layer of ash across the eastern part of the country, destroying farms and poisoning grazing land. In the aftermath, hundreds of Icelandic families, desperate, impoverished, and seeing no future in their homeland, boarded ships bound for Canada and the United States. They settled in Manitoba, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, founding communities that preserved Icelandic language and traditions far from the island. Today, the descendants of those emigrants number in the tens of thousands, and many maintain connections to Iceland and to the Icelandic language their grandparents carried across the Atlantic. Iceland's volcanic activity is inseparable from its seismic activity. Earthquakes are a fact of daily life on the island. Most are too small to feel, but larger tremors occur regularly, and damaging earthquakes, while infrequent, are part of the historical record. In the South Iceland seismic zone, earthquakes strong enough to damage buildings occur roughly every 100 years. More recently, the Reykjanes Peninsula has entered a period of intense volcanic and seismic unrest. Beginning in late 2023, a series of eruptions near the town of Grindavik forced the evacuation of the entire community. Over 3,000 people displaced from their homes as lava threatened the town itself. The eruptions continued into 2024 and beyond, with fissures opening in new locations, lava flowing across roads, and the future of the town hanging in an uncertain balance. For the residents of Grindavik, the eruptions were not an abstract geological event. They were the destruction of homes, businesses, and a way of life. The uncertainty, not knowing whether the eruptions would stop, whether the town could be saved, whether it was safe to return, was perhaps the cruelest aspect. Iceland may be accustomed to living with volcanoes, but that familiarity does not blunt the pain when the volcano comes for your home. Ice, glaciers, and the frozen heart. If fire built Iceland, ice shaped it. Roughly 11% of Iceland's surface is covered by glaciers. The largest of these, Vatnajökull, is the biggest glacier in Europe by volume, a dome of ice that covers more than 8,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Puerto Rico. In places, the ice is nearly 1,000 meters thick. Beneath it lie several active volcanoes, creating one of the most dramatic geological juxtapositions on the planet. Fire buried under ice, each one restraining the other, until one of them wins. Vatnajökull is not a single uniform sheet. It is a complex, living mass of ice that flows slowly outward from its center, sending glacier tongues down into the surrounding valleys and lowlands. Each of these outlet glaciers has its own character. Some end in calm lagoons where icebergs carve off and float in still water. Others grind down to black sand plains, leaving behind moraines, ridges of rock and debris pushed aside by the advancing ice. The most photographed of these glacier lagoons is Jökulsárlón on the southern edge of Vatnajökull. Here, icebergs carve from the tongue of the Breiðamerkurjökull glacier and drift slowly across a deep lagoon before eventually making their way out to sea through a narrow channel. Some of the icebergs are enormous, the size of houses, while others are small enough to hold in your hands. The colors are extraordinary. The ice ranges from pure white to deep, luminous blue. The blue caused by the density of the ice, which has been compressed under such pressure that it absorbs all colors of the spectrum except blue, which it reflects back. Some icebergs are streaked with lines of black volcanic ash, recording eruptions that happened centuries ago. The ash trapped in snowfall that was slowly compressed into ice and is only now being released as the glacier melts and calves. Across the road from Jökulsárlón, small icebergs that have washed out to sea are tossed back onto the black volcanic beach by the waves. This stretch of coast has come to be known as Diamond Beach because the chunks of crystal clear ice lying on the jet black sand look, for all the world, like enormous scattered diamonds, glinting in the low Arctic light. Glaciers are not static things. They flow slowly, relentlessly, under the weight of their own accumulated ice. A glacier is a river of ice, moving inches per day, grinding the rock beneath it into fine dust, carving valleys, shaping coastlines, leaving behind a transformed landscape when it eventually retreats. Iceland's glaciers have been in retreat for decades, and the pace has accelerated in recent years. Vatnajökull loses, on average, about 1 meter of ice thickness per year. Some of the smaller glaciers are disappearing entirely. In 2019, Iceland held a public ceremony to mark the loss of Ökjökull, known simply as Ok, a glacier that had been a named, mapped feature of the Icelandic landscape for centuries. A plaque was placed on the bare rock where the glacier had been, addressed to the future. It read, "This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it." The loss of Ökjökull was symbolic. It was a small glacier, and its disappearance did not directly affect many people, but it carried enormous weight as a marker of change in a country defined by ice. A country with ice in its very name. The melting of glaciers is not an abstract concern, it is personal, it is visible. Icelanders can see the retreat happening with their own eyes, year by year, comparing the glacier's edge to where it was in their parents' time, their grandparents' time. One of the most magical experiences Iceland offers is entering a glacial ice cave. These caves form naturally within and beneath glaciers, carved by meltwater during the warmer months and then frozen into their shapes when winter returns. No two are alike. They are temporary structures, lasting a single season or a handful of years before the glacier's movement collapses or reshapes them. Inside an ice cave, the world transforms. The walls glow with a deep, almost electric blue, the same blue as the icebergs in Jökulsárlón, produced by the same physics of compressed ice and filtered light. The ceiling curves overhead like the vault of a cathedral. Sounds are muffled. The air is cold and still. Light enters through the ice itself, giving everything a soft, diffused glow that feels almost underwater. Walking through an ice cave in Iceland is one of those experiences that bypasses language. You cannot adequately describe it to someone who has not been inside one. The beauty is too strange, too unlike anything else in daily life. You can only stand there, in that blue silence, and feel the weight of centuries of frozen water arching over your head, and wonder at a world that can produce something this improbable and this beautiful. Iceland's other glaciers each have their own stories. Snæfellsjökull, on the tip of the Snæfellsnes Peninsula in western Iceland, is a glacier-capped stratovolcano that has been dormant for roughly 2,000 years. It is perhaps best known for its role in literature. Jules Verne chose Snæfellsjökull as the entry point for his 1864 novel, Journey to the Center of the Earth. In the story, the characters descend through the volcano's crater into the hollow interior of the planet. On a clear day, Snæfellsjökull is visible across the bay from Reykjavik, a white shimmer on the western horizon. Many Icelanders consider it a place of spiritual energy, a claim that draws both reverence and gentle eye-rolling, depending on whom you ask. What is beyond dispute is its beauty. The glacier sits atop the volcano like a crown, catching the light in ways that change with the season and the hour, and the surrounding peninsula, with its lava fields, sea cliffs, fishing villages, and black pebble beaches, is among the most varied and beautiful landscapes in all of Iceland. Langjökull, the second largest glacier in Iceland, sits in the western highlands. In recent years, a man-made tunnel has been carved into its interior, allowing visitors to walk deep inside the glacier and see its layers of compressed ice, each one representing years of accumulated snowfall. The experience is akin to reading the rings of a tree, each layer a chapter, each shade of blue and white a record of a particular winter, a particular year, a particular moment in the glacier's long, slow life. Mýrdalsjökull, in the south, sits on top of the volcano Katla, the same Katla that geologists watch with such careful attention. If Katla were to erupt beneath Mýrdalsjökull, the heat would melt enormous quantities of ice in a very short time, producing a catastrophic glacial flood, a Jökulhlaup, that would surge across the lowlands to the south, carrying ice, rock, and debris toward the coast. This has happened before. It will happen again. The question is not if, but when. Walking on a glacier is one of the most surreal experiences available to a visitor in Iceland. Several of Vatnajökull's outlet glaciers are accessible for guided walks, and the experience of standing on ice that is hundreds of meters deep, listening to it creak and groan beneath your feet, is both exhilarating and humbling. The surface of a glacier is not the smooth white expanse that photographs suggest. It is rough, textured, and constantly changing. Meltwater carves channels that deepen into crevasses. Ash from past eruptions creates dark bands that twist through the ice like the lines of a topographic map turned sideways. Molin, vertical shafts carved by surface meltwater, plunge deep into the glacier's interior, the water disappearing into blue darkness. The sounds are extraordinary. Glaciers are not silent. They creak, pop, and groan as the ice shifts and settles under its own weight. Running water gurgles in unseen channels beneath the surface. Occasionally, a distant crack echoes across the ice field, a crevasse widening, a block of ice carving from the glacier's edge. These sounds are the voice of the glacier, the audible expression of a body of ice that is always in motion, always changing, even when it appears perfectly still. The retreat of Iceland's glaciers is not an abstract data point. It is something you can see with your own eyes, and the speed of the change is startling. Sólheimajökull, an outlet glacier of Mýrdalsjökull in the south, has become an unofficial measuring stick for glacial retreat in Iceland. Photographs from just 20 years ago show the glacier extending far down into the valley. Today, a growing lagoon occupies the space where the ice once reached, and the glacier's face has retreated hundreds of meters up the slope. Markers along the trail show where the glacier's edge stood in various years: 2000, 2010, 2020, and the gaps between the markers grow wider as the years progress. Scientists project that many of Iceland's smaller glaciers will disappear entirely within the next 1 to 2 centuries. Even Vatnajökull, the great ice dome, is expected to shrink dramatically. The implications are far-reaching: changes in river flow, impacts on hydroelectric power generation, loss of freshwater storage, alterations to the landscape that has defined Iceland's identity for millennia. For a country called the Land of Ice, the melting of its glaciers is not simply an environmental issue, it is an identity issue. It is a question about what Iceland means when the ice that gave it its name is gone. No one has a full answer yet, but the question is being asked. And in the Icelandic tradition, the asking is the beginning of the story. Water, waterfalls, rivers, and hot springs. If Iceland has one element in abundance beyond fire and ice, it is water. The island is drenched in it. Rain falls frequently on the coasts. Snow accumulates on the glaciers and highlands. Meltwater from those glaciers feeds rivers that cut through the landscape in braided silver channels. And everywhere, tumbling off cliffs, roaring through gorges, slipping quietly over moss-covered ledges, there are waterfalls. Iceland has more waterfalls per square kilometer than almost any country on Earth. Some estimates suggest there are over 10,000 of them, though the exact number depends on how you define a waterfall. Many are small, modest cascades in nameless streams, seen only by sheep and the occasional hiker, but dozens are world-class. The kind of waterfalls that make you stop and stand in silence, watching the waterfall. Gullfoss, the Golden Falls, is perhaps the most visited waterfall in Iceland, and for good reason. Located in the south, on the Fuita River, it falls in 2 stages into a narrow canyon that seems to swallow the water whole. Viewed from above, the falls appear to plunge into the earth and vanish. It is only when you approach the canyon's edge that you see the river continuing below, churning through a gorge it has carved over thousands of years. The name Golden Falls comes from the way the water catches the light. On a sunny afternoon, the spray shimmers with gold, and a rainbow often arcs across the gorge. In winter, the falls partially freeze, and the surrounding landscape is covered in ice and snow, creating a scene of stark, monochrome beauty. White ice, dark rock, and the relentless thunder of water that refuses to freeze entirely. Gullfoss very nearly became the site of a hydroelectric dam in the early 20th century. A local farmer's daughter named Sigrid Thomasdottir fought the proposal for years, reportedly threatening to throw herself into the falls if the dam were built. The dam was never constructed, not directly because of Sigriðar's protest, but she became a symbol of Iceland's growing environmental consciousness. Today, a memorial to her stands near the falls, and she is remembered as one of Iceland's first environmentalists. In the south of Iceland, where the coastal cliffs mark the old edge of the island before the lowlands were formed, a series of spectacular waterfalls cascade over the cliff edge. The most dramatic of these is Skogafoss, a wall of water 60 meters high and 25 meters wide that falls in a single, unbroken curtain. On a bright day, the mist from Skogafoss produces not one but sometimes two rainbows, their colors vivid against the dark cliff face. According to local legend, a Viking settler named Thrace Throlfsson hid a chest of gold behind Skogafoss. The chest was supposedly found years later by a local boy who managed to grasp its ring handle before it was pulled from his hands by the force of the water. The ring, the story goes, was preserved and can still be seen in a local museum. The chest of gold, if it ever existed, remains behind the waterfall. Nearby, Seljalandsfoss offers a different kind of experience. This waterfall, slightly smaller than Skogafoss, drops over a concave cliff face, and a path runs behind it. You can walk behind the falling water, looking out through the curtain at the green lowlands beyond. The light that filters through the spray gives the cave behind the falls an almost sacred quality, diffuse, shimmering, constantly moving. Further east, in the Skaftafell area of Vatnajökull National Park, Svartifoss, the Black Falls, is framed by columns of dark basalt that hang from the cliff face like the pipes of an organ. These hexagonal columns were formed when lava cooled slowly and evenly, contracting into geometric shapes as it solidified. The effect is architectural, nature imitating the work of a master builder. Svartifoss is said to have inspired the design of Hallgrímskirkja, the landmark church in Reykjavik whose facade echoes the same columnar basalt forms. In the north, the river Jökulsá, the glacial river of the mountains, carries meltwater from Vatnajökull north toward the Arctic Ocean. Along the way, it drops over Dettifoss, the most powerful waterfall in Europe. Dettifoss is not the tallest or the widest waterfall on the continent, but it moves the most water, an average of around 200 cubic meters per second, a figure that increases dramatically during summer melt. Standing near Dettifoss is a full-body experience. The ground shakes, the air is thick with spray, the roar of the water is so loud that conversation is impossible. The river, gray-brown with glacial sediment, hurls itself over the edge and crashes into the gorge below with a force that you feel in your chest. It is not a pretty waterfall. It is not delicate or romantic. It is raw, overwhelming, and magnificent in the way that only truly powerful natural forces can be. A short walk upstream, the same river drops over Selfoss, a wider but shorter falls that offers a gentler contrast. And downstream, Hafragilsfoss plunges into a dramatic canyon, accessible by a rough trail that few visitors bother to take. The reward for those who do is a view of the river gorge at its deepest, the water far below, the canyon walls stained with minerals and streaked with the nests of birds. Beyond the waterfalls, Iceland's water takes another form: hot springs. Not the developed commercial pools found in towns, though those are wonderful in their own right, but wild, natural hot springs tucked into valleys, hidden in lava fields, and bubbling up beside glacial rivers. One of the most beloved is Landmannalaugar in the southern highlands. Here, a warm stream flows from beneath a lava field into a shallow pool surrounded by rhyolite mountains, peaks painted in vivid shades of pink, orange, green, yellow, and purple by the minerals in the rock. The contrast between the warm water, the otherworldly mountains, and the vast empty highland that surrounds them is almost too beautiful to believe. Visitors soak in the warm stream, looking up at mountains that look like they were painted by a dreaming child. Smaller, unnamed hot springs are scattered across Iceland, some well known to locals, others genuine secrets, shared only with trusted friends. Part of the joy of traveling in Iceland is stumbling upon these hidden pools, a warm creek in a valley, a natural stone basin on a hillside, a warm river mixing with a cold stream to create a pool at the perfect temperature. The earth gives its heat freely here. All you have to do is find it and sit down and let the warmth soak into your bones while the wind moves across the empty land above you. Iceland's rivers deserve attention of their own. They are not like the rivers of most countries, slow, established waterways that have run in the same channels for millennia. Many of Iceland's rivers are glacial, fed by meltwater from the glaciers, carrying enormous loads of sediment that give them a milky gray-brown color. These rivers change course frequently, braiding across wide, flat outwash plains called sandor in a constantly shifting network of channels. The glacial rivers of the south, Skeiðará, Jökulsá á Sólheimasandi, Markarfljót, are some of the most powerful and unpredictable rivers in Europe. During summer melt, or during volcanic eruptions beneath glaciers, they can swell to enormous size in a matter of hours. The Jökulhlaup, the glacial outburst flood, is a distinctly Icelandic phenomenon, a sudden catastrophic release of meltwater from beneath a glacier, often triggered by volcanic heat. A Jökulhlaup can carry house-sized blocks of ice, boulders and debris across the sandur at terrifying speed, destroying bridges, roads, and anything else in its path. The Skeiðará sandur, a vast black sand plain in the southeast, bears the scars of repeated jökulhlaupus. Twisted steel girders from destroyed bridges lie scattered across the sand, left in place as memorials to the power of the floods. Driving across the sandur on the ring road, past these twisted remnants, is a humbling reminder of what glacial rivers are capable of. But not all Icelandic rivers are grey and glacial. The spring-fed rivers of the south and west run crystal clear, their water filtered through layers of porous lava rock before emerging cold and pure. These rivers, the Thjosa, the Ölfusá, and others, are among the finest salmon rivers in the world, and fishing permits for the best beats can cost thousands of dollars per day. Salmon fishing in Iceland is a matter of some national passion. The rivers are carefully managed, catches are strictly limited, and the quality of the fishing is legendary. Atlantic salmon return each summer to the rivers where they were born, fighting their way upstream through rapids and waterfalls in a journey that has been playing out in these rivers for thousands of years. For many Icelanders, the river is a place of deep personal connection, a place to stand in cold water, casting a line, listening to the current, watching the light move across the valley. Fishing in Iceland is not just sport, it is meditation. It is a way of being present in the landscape, of participating in a rhythm that is older than the human settlement of the island. In the north, Lake Mývatn, Midge Lake, named honestly for the enormous clouds of non-biting midges that hover over it in summer, is one of Iceland's ecological treasures. The lake is shallow, rich in nutrients, and surrounded by a landscape of volcanic formations that would be extraordinary anywhere but is, in Iceland, merely one more astonishing place among many. Mývatn is one of the most important breeding sites for ducks in Europe. 15 species of duck breed here, more than at any other single location in the continent. The most distinctive is the harlequin duck, a strikingly patterned bird that breeds in fast-flowing streams feeding into the lake. Barrow's golden eye, a diving duck rare in Europe, is also found here in significant numbers. The area around Mývatn is a geological showcase. The Dimmuborgir lava formations, a labyrinth of collapsed lava tubes and pillars that looks like the ruins of a dark, ancient city. The Skútustaðagiga pseudo-craters, formed by steam explosions rather than volcanic eruptions. The Námaskjöld geothermal area with its boiling mud and hissing vents, and Krafla, a volcanic system that produced a 9-year eruption series beginning in 1975, sending lava flows across the surrounding highland in what became known as the Krafla fires. Mývatn is a place where all of Iceland's elements converge: fire beneath the surface, water in the lake, wind across the open terrain, and life, abundant, resilient, thriving life, everywhere you look. Light and darkness, there is one more element that defines Iceland, and it is neither rock nor water nor ice. It is light, or, more precisely, the extraordinary relationship between light and darkness that governs life on this island. Because Iceland sits so close to the Arctic Circle, the length of its days varies dramatically across the year, more dramatically than anywhere most people have ever lived. In the depths of winter, around the solstice in late December, Reykjavik receives only about 4 hours of daylight, and even that daylight is pale, thin, and low. The sun barely clears the southern horizon before beginning its descent again. The sky is a gradient of dusky blues and faint oranges for much of the day, as if dawn and dusk have merged into a single, prolonged twilight. The darkness of an Icelandic winter is not merely an absence of light, it is a presence. It settles over the island like a blanket, and life adjusts to it. Icelanders light candles, lots of them. They gather indoors. They read. Iceland publishes more books per capita than any other country in the world, and the long dark winters are part of the reason why. When the world outside is dark and cold, stories become a form of warmth. Then summer arrives, and the world inverts. In June, around the summer solstice, Iceland experiences near continuous daylight. In Reykjavik, the sun dips below the horizon for only about 3 hours. And even then, the sky never fully darkens. It glows with a pale, luminous twilight that feels like perpetual dawn. On the island of Grimsey, which sits directly on the Arctic Circle, the sun does not set at all on the longest day. It touches the horizon and then rises again, as if it changed its mind. The midnight sun transforms Iceland. The sky at midnight is golden. Shadows stretch impossibly long across the landscape. The light has a quality unlike anything found at lower latitudes. Warm but diffuse, gentle but persistent, painting everything in soft tones that photographers call the golden hour. Except that in Iceland, the golden hour lasts all night. People stay up late. Children play outside at midnight. Farmers work the long hours that the brief summer demands. There is a giddiness to Icelandic summers, a sense of liberation after the long dark, an urge to fill every hour with activity and light and life before the darkness returns. But it is the darkness of winter that gives Iceland one of its greatest gifts, the northern lights. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, are caused by charged particles from the sun colliding with gases in the Earth's atmosphere, guided toward the poles by the planet's magnetic field. Iceland's position near the magnetic North Pole makes it one of the best places on Earth to see them. On a clear winter night, away from the lights of Reykjavik, the aurora can be breathtaking. It begins as a faint green glow on the northern horizon, easy to mistake for a cloud or a trick of the eye. Then it brightens. It moves. Ribbons of green light begin to unfurl across the sky, bending and shifting like curtains blown by an invisible wind. If the display is strong, purple and red join the green, and the entire sky becomes a canvas of moving light reflected in the snow below. The northern lights are silent. That is part of their power. There is no thunder, no roar, no soundtrack, just light moving across the sky in patterns that seem both random and purposeful, as if the atmosphere itself is dreaming. Some Icelanders say that if you whistle at the northern lights, they will come closer. Others say you should never whistle at them, or they will reach down and take you. These are old stories, carried from a time when the lights were unexplained and therefore both beautiful and frightening. This rhythm of light and dark shapes the Icelandic psyche in ways that are difficult to overstate. The darkness of winter, while cozy in its way, can also be heavy. Seasonal affective disorder is common. The arrival of light in spring is not just noticed. It is celebrated, savored, spoken about. Icelanders track the lengthening days with a kind of joy that people in more temperate climates rarely feel, because they have earned the light. They have sat through the darkness and waited for it. And when the light returns, when the first truly long day arrives, and the sun stays up past midnight for the first time, there is a collective exhale. The island wakes up, the world opens, and for a few precious months, Iceland becomes one of the brightest, most luminous places on Earth. Photographers and filmmakers speak of Iceland's light with a reverence that borders on obsession. The island sits at a latitude where the sun is always low in the sky. Even in summer, it never climbs to the overhead position that it reaches in more southerly countries. This low angle means that sunlight in Iceland is always filtered through a thick layer of atmosphere, which strips away the harsh blue tones and leaves behind a soft, golden quality that wraps around objects instead of hitting them from above. In winter, the few hours of daylight are almost entirely composed of what photographers call golden hour and blue hour. The warm, angled light of sunrise and sunset, and the cool, diffuse twilight that precedes and follows it. Because the sun barely clears the horizon, these transitional periods extend to fill almost the entire day. The result is a quality of light that is gentle, emotional, and hauntingly beautiful. A light that makes even the simplest landscape look like a painting. In summer, the midnight sun creates conditions that are, for photographers, almost too good. The golden light lasts all night. Shadows are long and dramatic. Colors are saturated. The sky at midnight is a symphony of peach, rose, gold, and pale blue. The temptation to stay out shooting all night is real, and many visitors to Iceland in summer find their sleep schedule completely destroyed by the light. The body refuses to rest when the sky insists it is still daytime. There is even a distinctive Icelandic weather phenomenon related to light, the halon, or sun dog, a bright spot or ring of light that appears on either side of the sun when ice crystals in the atmosphere refract sunlight. In Iceland's cold, moist air, sundogs are relatively common, particularly in winter, and they add yet another dimension to the island's already extraordinary relationship with light. On clear winter nights, when the northern lights are quiet and the sky is dark, Iceland offers some of the finest stargazing in Europe. The low population density, the absence of light pollution outside Reykjavik, and the dry, cold winter air create conditions that allow the Milky Way to arc across the sky in a river of light, visible, detailed, and humbling. The ancient Icelanders knew the stars well. They used them for navigation, for timekeeping, and for the stories they wove into the constellations. The Norse had their own names for the stars and their own mythologies to explain their patterns. Some of these names survive in Icelandic. The Big Dipper is Karlsvognin, Charles's Wain, a name shared with other European traditions. The Pleiades are Sjústjörnurnar, the seven stars. Today, Iceland's dark skies are recognized as a valuable resource. Efforts are underway to designate parts of the interior as dark sky reserves, protecting them from the light pollution that is slowly creeping outward from Reykjavik and other towns. In a world where most people have never seen the Milky Way from their own backyard, Iceland's dark skies are a treasure, one more gift from the island's remoteness and its small population. The coastlines, fords, and islands. Iceland's coastline is where the island meets the immensity of the North Atlantic, and the meeting is rarely gentle. The southern coast is a long, mostly straight stretch of black sand beaches, volcanic sand, ground from basalt and lava rock by the relentless action of the waves. These beaches are beautiful and dangerous. The waves that crash onto them are powerful, unpredictable, and freezing cold. Sneaker waves, unexpectedly large waves that surge far up the beach, are a genuine hazard, and signs warn visitors to never turn their back on the sea. At Reynisfara, near the village of Vik, the black sand beach is framed by towering basalt columns, the same hexagonal formations found at Svartifoss, and punctuated by sea stacks called Reynisdrangar, jagged pillars of rock rising from the surf. According to legend, the sea stacks are trolls who were caught in the sunlight while trying to drag a ship ashore, and were turned to stone. On a stormy day, with waves crashing against the stacks and spray filling the air, the legend feels almost plausible. The northwestern corner of Iceland is the Westfjords, a large, claw-shaped peninsula that reaches out toward Greenland. The Westfjords are the oldest part of Iceland geologically, and the most deeply eroded. Glaciers have carved deep fjords into the basalt, creating a landscape of narrow inlets, steep-sided valleys, and towering sea cliffs. The west fjords are remote. The roads that connect the small villages along the fjords are often narrow, winding, and unpaved. In winter, some of these roads close entirely, and communities can be isolated for weeks. The population of the entire Westfjords region is only about 7,000 people, roughly the same as a single neighborhood in most cities. But the remoteness is part of the appeal. The Westfjords feel like the end of the world in the most magnificent way possible. At Latrabjörg, the westernmost point of Iceland, and the westernmost point of Europe, depending on how you define Europe, sea cliffs rise over 400 meters above the ocean. Millions of seabirds nest on these cliffs. Puffins, razorbills, guillemots, and fulmars, their calls filling the air as they wheel and dive. The puffins, in particular, are fearless. They waddle along the cliff edges, their colorful beaks stuffed with fish, barely glancing at the humans who have hiked hours to see them. The Atlantic puffin is, in many ways, the unofficial mascot of Iceland. Roughly 60% of the world's Atlantic puffin population breeds in Iceland, with millions of pairs nesting in burrows on coastal cliffs and offshore islands each summer. They arrive in late April or early May and leave by mid-August, spending the rest of the year at sea far from land. Puffins are endearing creatures. They look perpetually surprised, with their round bodies, short wings, and large, multicolored beaks. They are surprisingly fast swimmers, using their wings to fly underwater in pursuit of small fish. But they are awkward on land and comically ungraceful in the air. They must beat their wings hundreds of times per minute to stay aloft, and their landings are often closer to controlled crashes than graceful arrivals. The relationship between Icelanders and puffins is complicated. Puffins have been hunted for food in Iceland for centuries, and puffin meat remains a traditional dish in some parts of the country, particularly the Westman Islands. But puffin populations have declined in recent decades, partly due to warming seas affecting their food supply, and hunting has been sharply curtailed. For most modern Icelanders, puffins are creatures to be watched, photographed, and protected, not eaten. Iceland's bird life extends far beyond the puffin, though the puffin understandably gets the most attention. The island is a critical breeding ground for dozens of seabird and waterfowl species. The Arctic tern, a bird weighing barely more than a few slices of bread, breeds in Iceland before embarking on a migration that takes it all the way to Antarctica and back, a round trip of roughly 70,000 kilometers per year, the longest migration of any animal on Earth. Arctic terns are fiercely protective of their nesting sites. They dive bomb anything that comes too close, including humans, and a nesting colony of terns is a genuinely intimidating place to walk through. The birds swoop at your head, screaming, their sharp beaks aimed at the highest point of your body. Icelanders who live near tern colonies learn to carry a stick or a flag above their heads when passing through, giving the birds a target that is not their skull. The great auk, the original penguin, a large, flightless seabird that once bred in vast colonies on rocky islands in the North Atlantic, was driven to extinction in Iceland in 1844, when the last known pair was killed on the island of Eldey off the Reykjanes Peninsula. The story of the great auk's extinction is one of the saddest chapters in the history of human interaction with wildlife, a species that survived for millions of years, wiped out in a few centuries by hunting and egg collection. A memorial to the great auk stands in several locations in Iceland, a reminder that even in a country that values its natural world, loss is possible and sometimes irreversible. Off the southern coast, a small archipelago called the Westman Islands, Vestmannaeyjar, rises from the sea. Only one of the islands, Heimaey, is permanently inhabited, with a population of about 4,000 people. The islands are volcanic in origin, and their recent history is dominated by an eruption that tested the limits of human resilience. In January 1973, A fissure opened on the eastern edge of Jaime, just a few hundred meters from the town. Lava began to pour out, and within hours, the entire population of over 5,000 people was evacuated to the mainland by fishing boats in the middle of the night in winter. It was one of the most efficient emergency evacuations in modern history. The eruption continued for months. Lava flows threatened to close the harbor, the lifeblood of the island's fishing economy. In an audacious and somewhat desperate move, Icelanders sprayed the advancing lava with seawater, attempting to cool and solidify it before it could block the harbor entrance. It worked, partially. The harbor was narrowed but not closed, and the cooled lava actually improved the harbor's shelter from storms. When the eruption ended and the residents returned, they found their town transformed. Hundreds of homes had been buried under lava and ash. A new volcanic cone, Eldfell, had risen on the eastern edge of the island, but the people came back. They dug out what they could, built new homes on top of the lava, and carried on. Today, the Westman Islands are still a thriving fishing community, and the heat from the 1973 lava flow still warms some of the island's homes. The Westman Islands are also home to one of Iceland's most endearing annual traditions, the Puffling Patrol. Each August, when young pufflings, leave their burrows for the first time and attempt to fly out to sea, many become disoriented by the lights of the town. Instead of flying toward the dark ocean, they follow the artificial lights into the village, where they crash land on streets, in gardens, and against buildings. Every year, the children of Jaime go out at night with flashlights and cardboard boxes, collecting the confused pufflings and carrying them safely to the shore, where they are released toward the ocean. It is a tradition that has been practiced for generations, and it is taken seriously. The children consider it their duty, and they carry it out with a mixture of tenderness and efficiency that is deeply touching to witness. The image of Icelandic children, bundled in warm clothes against the August chill, gently cradling baby puffins in their hands and setting them free at the water's edge, is one of the most beautiful scenes in Icelandic life. It captures something essential about the relationship between Icelanders and their natural world, a relationship built not on dominance or exploitation, but on coexistence, responsibility, and care. At the northern tip of the West Fjords lies Hornstrandir, a nature reserve that is perhaps the most remote and wild place in Iceland. There are no roads, no services, no permanent inhabitants. Access is by boat only. In summer, when the weather permits, the handful of old farmsteads that dot the coastline were abandoned in the 1950s when the last families gave up the struggle to sustain life in such an isolated place. Today, Hornstrandir belongs to the Arctic fox, Iceland's only native land mammal, an animal that was here before the settlers arrived and will likely be here long after the last human visits. The foxes of Hornstrandir are unusually tame, accustomed to the occasional hikers who visit in summer and untroubled by human presence. They approach with curiosity rather than fear, their dark eyes watchful, their thick fur white in winter, brown in summer, perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions. Walking in Hornstrandir is walking at the edge of human possibility. The cliffs are enormous. The sea is vast. The silence is broken only by the cry of seabirds and the wind. You are, in the most literal sense, at the end of the road. Beyond this point, there is only ocean, and then, eventually, Greenland. It is one of the few places in Europe where you can still experience genuine wilderness. Land that has been returned to nature and shows no sign of ever being reclaimed. The most remarkable island in the Westman archipelago is one that nobody is allowed to visit. Surte Sea emerged from the ocean in November 1963 when an underwater volcanic eruption broke the surface and over the course of 3.5 years built a new island from nothing. Scientists named it after Surtur, the fire giant of Norse mythology. Surtsey is one of the newest pieces of land on Earth. Since its formation, it has been kept strictly off limits to the public, accessible only to a small number of scientists who study how life colonizes a completely barren landscape. They have watched, over decades, as mosses took hold in the lava, as seeds arrived on the wind and in the droppings of birds, as insects appeared, as seals began to haul out on its shores. Surtsey is a living laboratory of creation, a place where scientists can study, in real time, the process that has shaped every island on Earth. The island is slowly shrinking, its soft volcanic rock eroded by the waves. One day, perhaps in a century or two, the sea will reclaim it entirely. But for now, Surtsey stands as a reminder that the Earth is not finished making itself, and that life, given even the most inhospitable starting point, finds a way. The settling of Iceland. For most of human history, Iceland was empty. No indigenous people lived there. No ancient civilization built on its shores. When the first humans arrived, the island was exactly as the geological forces had made it: volcanic rock, glaciers, rivers, and silence. No roads, no farms, no buildings, just the land and the wind and the cry of seabirds. The question of who first set foot on Iceland is a matter of some debate. Irish monks, Papa as the Norse later called them, may have reached the island as early as the 7th or 8th century, sailing in small leather-covered boats called currachs in search of solitude and communion with God. There are hints of their presence in Icelandic texts and place names, but no definitive archaeological evidence has been found. If they were there, they left little trace. What is better documented is the arrival of the Norse. The traditional account, recorded in medieval Icelandic texts, names the first permanent settler as Ingólfur Arnason, a Norwegian chieftain who arrived with his household around the year 874. According to the story, Ingólfur followed the Viking custom of throwing his high seat pillars, the carved wooden posts that flanked his seat of honor, overboard as he approached the coast, vowing to settle wherever the pillars washed ashore. They were found in a bay on the southwestern coast, in a place where steam rose from hot springs along the shore. Ingólfur named the place Reykjavik, Smoke Bay, for the columns of geothermal steam he saw rising from the ground. It was not smoke, of course, but the steam from the hot springs that still warm the city today. Reykjavik would eventually become the capital and largest city of Iceland, though in Ingólfur's time, it was nothing more than a farmstead on a foggy coast. The settlement of Iceland happened rapidly. Within about 60 years, from roughly 870 to 930, the entire habitable coastline of the island was claimed. The settlers came primarily from Norway, many of them fleeing the consolidating power of King Harald Fairhair, who was unifying Norway under a single crown and demanding submission from independent chieftains who had no interest in submitting. They also came from the Norse colonies in the British Isles, Scotland, Ireland, and the islands between. Many brought with them Celtic slaves, servants, and wives. Genetic studies of modern Icelanders have confirmed this mixed heritage. The male lineage is predominantly Norse, while the female lineage shows a significant Celtic contribution. Iceland was, from its very beginning, a blended society. The settlers found an island that was, by North Atlantic standards, remarkably hospitable. The coastal lowlands were covered in grass, and the valleys were filled with birch forest, low, scrubby birch, not the tall forests of Scandinavia, but dense enough to provide fuel and building material. Rivers and lakes teemed with fish. Seals and seabirds provided additional food. The hot springs offered warmth. It was not easy, but it was possible. The most significant political achievement of the settlement era was the establishment of the Alþingi, the Alþing, in 930. This was a national assembly, held each summer at Þingvellir, where chieftains from across the island gathered to settle disputes, make laws, and conduct business. The Alþingi is often described as the world's oldest surviving parliament, though its early form was more of a legislative and judicial assembly than a parliament in the modern sense. The assembly met in the open air, in the natural amphitheatre formed by the Rift Valley at Þingvellir. The law, the only paid official, stood on a rock called the Lögberg, the Law Rock, and recited the laws from memory, 1/3 of the legal code each year, cycling through the entire body of law over 3 years. There were no police, no army, no king, Disputes were settled by negotiation, arbitration, and, when those failed, by the threat of social exclusion or blood feud. It was an imperfect system. Wealth and power mattered, and justice was not always just. But it was also a remarkable experiment in self-governance for its time, a society that managed its affairs through assembly and consensus rather than royal decree. The Icelanders had left Norway to escape a king, and they built a society that had no room for one. The society that emerged during the Commonwealth period, from 930 to 1262, was unlike anything else in medieval Europe. There was no executive authority, no central government, no professional bureaucracy. Power was distributed among chieftains called Gotha, each of whom provided legal representation and protection to a group of followers in exchange for loyalty and support. Followers could, in theory, switch their allegiance from one Gothi to another if they were dissatisfied, creating a kind of market for governance that had no parallel in feudal Europe. The economy was based on agriculture and fishing. Dairy farming, particularly the production of skyr and butter, was central to the food supply. Haymaking was the critical summer activity, because the quantity of hay harvested determined how many animals could be kept alive through the winter. A bad hay season could mean starvation, not for the people directly, but for the livestock on which the people depended. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons with an intensity that modern people can barely imagine. Spring was for lambing and the release of sheep to the highlands. Summer was for fishing, haymaking, and the brief burst of growing. Autumn was for the sheep roundup, the slaughter of animals that could not be kept through winter, and the preservation of food. Winter was for survival, huddled in the bathstoffa, rationing food, telling stories, waiting for the light to return. This rhythm, repeated year after year, century after century, created a people of extraordinary endurance and patience. Icelanders learned to think in seasons, to plan months ahead, to accept that the world moves at its own pace and that human wishes do not accelerate the sun or slow the storm. This patience, this deep, practiced acceptance of forces beyond human control, remains a defining characteristic of the Icelandic temperament. In the year 1000, the Alþingi faced its most divisive issue, religion. Christianity had been spreading through Scandinavia, and pressure was mounting, both from Christian converts within Iceland and from the Christian king of Norway, for Iceland to abandon its traditional Norse beliefs. The debate at the Alþingi that year threatened to tear the country apart. Christian and pagan factions were entrenched, and some spoke of dividing Iceland into two separate legal communities, one Christian, one pagan. The law, a man named Þorgeir Ljúfsvetning Agodi, was asked to decide the matter. He was a pagan himself, but he was respected by both sides. According to the saga accounts, Þorgeir lay down under his cloak for a day and a night, thinking. When he emerged, he declared that Iceland would become Christian, but with concessions. The old practices of exposing unwanted children and eating horse meat would continue to be permitted, and people could worship the old gods in private. The decision was pragmatic rather than spiritual. Þorgeir argued that a divided legal system would destroy the country. Unity, even at the cost of compromise, was more important than purity. Iceland became Christian, at least officially, in a single day. It is one of the most remarkable religious conversions in European history, decided not by war or conquest, but by a single man lying under a cloak, thinking carefully, and choosing peace. It was from Iceland, from this small, remote, barely established society, that the Norse made what may be their most astonishing achievement, the discovery of North America. Around the year 982, Eric the Red, an Icelander who had been exiled for manslaughter, sailed west and discovered a large, mostly ice-covered landmass that he named Greenland, reportedly choosing the optimistic name to attract settlers. Despite the somewhat misleading branding, a colony was established on Greenland's southwest coast, and it survived for nearly 500 years. Eric's son, Leif Erikson, pushed even further. Around the year 1000, Leif sailed west from Greenland and reached the coast of North America, a place the Norse called Vinland. The exact location of Vinland has been debated for centuries, but the discovery of a Norse settlement at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, in 1960 confirmed that the Norse did indeed reach North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. The Vinland settlement did not last. Conflicts with the indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skraelinga, hostility, distance, and the difficulty of maintaining a colony so far from any support made the venture unsustainable. The Norse withdrew, and North America returned to the sole possession of its indigenous inhabitants for another 5 centuries. But the fact remains. It was from Iceland, a country that had itself been settled only a century earlier, that Europeans first reached the Americas. The audacity of the achievement, sailing into the unknown in open boats, with no maps, no charts, no guarantee of return, speaks to a quality that defines the Icelandic character, a willingness to face the unknown, to push beyond the edge of the map, and to see what lies beyond. One of the most remarkable documents from Iceland's settlement era is the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, written in the 12th and 13th centuries. Drawing on earlier sources and oral tradition, it records the names and landholdings of over 400 settlers and their descendants. It tells you who settled where, who they married, what disputes they had, and how the land was divided. For modern Icelanders, the Landnámabók is more than a historical document. It is a family tree. Because Iceland's population has been relatively small and relatively stable, and because record keeping has been a national obsession for over 1,000 years, many modern Icelanders can trace their ancestry directly back to specific settlers named in the Landnámabók. They know which farm their family came from. They know which ship their ancestors sailed on. They know the name of the Norwegian chieftain who decided over 1,000 years ago that a volcanic island in the middle of the North Atlantic was a good place to make a home. This depth of genealogical knowledge is almost unique in the world. Most people in most countries cannot trace their family history back more than a few generations. Icelanders can go back a millennium. The past, in Iceland, is not a foreign country. It is a family member. The age of sagas, the centuries that followed Iceland's settlement and conversion, produced something extraordinary. The sagas. The Icelandic sagas are one of the great literary achievements of the medieval world. Written in Old Norse prose, mostly in the 13th and 14th centuries, though they describe events from earlier periods, the sagas tell the stories of Iceland's founding families, their feuds, their loves, their voyages, their triumphs, and their deaths. They are not fairy tales. They are not religious texts. They are, in a sense, the world's first realistic novels, narratives grounded in specific places, featuring named characters who act from recognizable human motivations: pride, jealousy, loyalty, revenge, love, and the simple desire to be left alone. The greatest of the sagas, and one of the finest works of literature produced in medieval Europe, is Njáls saga. It tells the story of Njál Tordriason, a wise, peaceful farmer, and his friend Gunnar Hamundarson, a charismatic warrior, and the chain of feuds, betrayals, and acts of violence that eventually consume them both. Njál's saga is a tragedy in the classical sense. Its characters are not simply good or evil. They are complex, flawed, caught in a web of social obligation and personal pride that drives them toward outcomes they can see coming but cannot prevent. The burning of Njál and his family in their farmhouse, attacked by enemies they had tried to make peace with, is one of the most devastating scenes in medieval literature. What makes the sagas remarkable is not just their literary quality but their setting. The places described in the sagas are real places in Iceland, and they are still there. You can visit Bergþórsfell, the farm where Njál lived and died. You can walk the path that Gunnar rode when he was outlawed and exiled. When Gunnar, riding away from his farm for the last time, turned in his saddle and looked back at the green slopes of his home and said the words that every Icelandic schoolchild knows: "How fair the slopes are," he was looking at a hillside you can see today essentially unchanged. This connection between literature and landscape is unique to Iceland. The sagas are not set in a mythical realm. They are set here, in this valley, on that hillside, beside that river. Walking through the Icelandic countryside is walking through the world of the sagas. The past is not buried beneath cities and concrete. It is right there, in the grass and the rock, and the names on the map. The other great sagas each illuminate a different facet of the Icelandic character. Egil's saga tells the story of Egil Skallagrimsson, a Viking, poet, and deeply complicated man, by turns brilliant, generous, brutal, and petty. He composed some of the finest Norse poetry ever written, and he was also capable of terrible violence. Egil's saga refuses to simplify its protagonist. He is fully human, in all the uncomfortable ways that implies. Laxdæla saga is a love story, or rather, a story about the destruction that love can cause when it collides with social expectation and male pride. At its center is Gudrun Osvifrasdóttir, one of the strongest female characters in medieval literature, whose 4 marriages and 1 forbidden love shape the fate of an entire community. The saga of Grettir the Strong tells the story of an outlaw, a man of immense physical strength and courage who is also cursed with bad luck and a talent for making enemies. Grettir spends years as a fugitive in the Icelandic wilderness, living in caves, fighting ghosts and monsters. The monster Glamour, in particular, is one of the most frightening creatures in all of saga literature, and slowly losing his grip on the humanity that once made him admirable. Alongside the family sagas, medieval Icelanders also preserved, and in some cases composed, the great mythological and poetic texts of Norse literature. The Prose Edda, written by the chieftain, historian and poet Snorri Sturluson around 1220, is the most comprehensive source we have for Norse mythology. Without Snorri's work, much of what we know about Odin, Thor, Loki, the world tree Yggdrasil, Ragnarok, and the creation and destruction of the Norse cosmos would have been lost. The Poetic Edda, a collection of older poems preserved in a 13th century manuscript, contains some of the most powerful and haunting poetry of the medieval world. The Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, describes the creation of the world, the rise and fall of the gods, and the final battle of Ragnarok, where gods and giants destroy each other and the world sinks into the sea, only to rise again, green and renewed. It is worth pausing to appreciate the significance of what medieval Icelanders accomplished. A small, isolated, largely agricultural society, never more than about 50 or 60,000 people, produced a body of literature that rivals anything created in medieval Europe. They did this without universities, without royal patronage, without a literary establishment. They did it because they valued stories, because they believed that the lives of ordinary people, farmers, chieftains, outlaws, women, were worth recording, and because they had long, dark winters in which to write. The saga tradition has never really ended in Iceland. The country's literary culture today is among the richest per capita in the world. Iceland publishes more books per person than any other nation, a tradition so deep that there is even a term for the pre-Christmas flood of new titles, the Jólabókaflóð, or Christmas book flood. Icelanders give books as gifts on Christmas Eve and spend the night reading, a custom that feels like a direct descendant of the saga tradition, stories shared in the darkest time of year when the wind howls outside and the fire burns low. Modern Icelandic literature carries the DNA of the sagas. The novelist Halldór Laxness, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1955, wrote about rural Icelandic life with a mixture of realism, humor, and deep compassion that echoes the saga tradition while being entirely modern. His novel, Independent People, the story of a stubborn sheep farmer who values his independence above all else, including the well-being of his family, is widely considered one of the great novels of the 20th century. The sagas taught Iceland that stories matter, that remembering matters, that the lives of people in a small, remote place are as worthy of great literature as the lives of kings and empires. That lesson has never been forgotten. Snorri Sturluson, the chieftain, historian and poet who wrote the Prose Edda and Heimskringla, the great chronicle of the Norwegian kings, deserves a moment of our attention because his life embodies both the brilliance and the tragedy of medieval Iceland. Snorri was the most powerful man in Iceland during the early 13th century. He was wealthy, politically ambitious, a brilliant writer, and a complicated, sometimes ruthless figure. He traveled to Norway, where he was drawn into the politics of the Norwegian court, and he made promises to King Haakon IV that he either could not or would not keep. When he returned to Iceland, he found his political alliances crumbling and his enemies closing in. On the night of September 23, 1241, a group of armed men arrived at Snorri's home in Reykholt. They found him hiding in the cellar. According to the accounts, Snorri's last words were "Egi skal hugva," do not strike. They struck. Snorri's assassination was part of the larger upheaval of the Sturlung Age, the period of civil war and political chaos that would eventually lead Iceland to surrender its independence to Norway. But his literary legacy endured. Without Snorri, we would have lost most of what we know about Norse mythology. Without his prose Edda, the stories of Thor and Odin, of Ragnarok and the World Tree would have faded into fragments and footnotes. His death was a political murder. His life's work was a gift to all of humanity. Today you can visit Reykholt and sit beside Snorrilaug, Snorri's pool, a small, stone-lined hot tub fed by a natural hot spring, where the great writer is said to have soaked and thought and composed. The pool is still there, still warm, still quietly steaming in a green valley in western Iceland. It is one of the most peaceful places in the country. The physical manuscripts of the sagas are among Iceland's most treasured possessions. Most of the surviving medieval manuscripts were collected in the 17th and 18th centuries by Árni Magnússon, an Icelandic scholar working in Copenhagen, who spent his life gathering, preserving, and cataloguing the written heritage of Iceland. When a fire swept through Copenhagen in 1728, Árni reportedly rushed into the burning city to save as many manuscripts as he could. Some were lost, others were damaged, but the core of the collection survived, thanks to his determination. For centuries, the manuscripts were kept in Copenhagen, a source of persistent frustration for Icelanders who regarded them as their cultural patrimony, held hostage by a former colonial power. After decades of negotiation, Denmark agreed to return the manuscripts to Iceland, and the first shipment arrived in Reykjavik on April 21, 1971. The event was treated as a national celebration. Thousands of people lined the harbor to watch the manuscripts, including the Codex Regius, the single most important manuscript of Old Norse literature. Carried ashore, people wept. It was not simply the return of old books. It was the return of the nation's memory. Today, the manuscripts are housed in the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies at the University of Iceland, where they are preserved, studied, and digitized. They remain, for Icelanders, objects of genuine reverence. The physical evidence that a small, remote, impoverished society produced one of the great literatures of the medieval world. Centuries of hardship. The story of Iceland from the 14th century through the 18th is largely a story of survival. The medieval golden age, the age of the sagas, of the Althing at Thingvellir, of relative prosperity and independence, did not last. A series of calamities, both natural and political, pushed Iceland into centuries of poverty and hardship that tested the limits of what a small, isolated community could endure. The first blow was the loss of independence. In 1262, after decades of increasingly violent feuds between powerful chieftains, a period known as the Age of the Sturlungs, the Icelandic chieftains agreed to submit to the Norwegian crown. The promise was stability. The Norwegian king would guarantee peace and regular trade in exchange for Icelandic loyalty and taxes. The reality, as it unfolded over the following centuries, was rather different. When Norway was absorbed into the Danish crown in 1380, Iceland became a Danish dependency, a status it would hold for over 500 years until 1944. For much of that time, Denmark's interest in Iceland was primarily extractive. The Danish crown imposed trade monopolies that restricted Icelanders' ability to trade freely with foreign merchants. Danish merchants set the prices for the goods Icelanders depended on: timber, grain, iron, cloth, and Icelanders had no choice but to accept. The timber situation was particularly severe. When the first settlers arrived, Iceland had been partially covered in birch forest. Perhaps as much as a quarter of the island's lowlands were wooded. Within a few centuries, the settlers had cut down almost all of it, using the wood for fuel, building, and charcoal production. The trees did not grow back. Iceland's climate and the grazing of sheep prevented regeneration. By the 15th century, Iceland was essentially treeless, a condition that persists in many parts of the island today. Without domestic timber, Icelanders were entirely dependent on imported wood, which the Danish trade monopoly made expensive and scarce. The Black Death reached Iceland in 1402, nearly 50 years after it had swept through mainland Europe. When it arrived, it was devastating. Over the following 2 years, an estimated 1/3 to half of the population died. The plague returned several times over the next century, each time pushing the population lower. Then came the volcanoes. We have already spoken of the Laki eruption of 1783 and its catastrophic consequences, the mist hardships that killed a quarter of the population. But Laki was only the worst of many volcanic disasters. Eruptions of Hekla, Katla, and other volcanoes punctuated Iceland's history with deadly regularity, destroying farmland, killing livestock, and plunging the island into famine. The combination of disease, volcanic disaster, trade monopoly, and a cooling climate, the Little Ice Age was particularly harsh on Iceland. Expanding sea ice and shortening growing seasons reduced Iceland's population to its lowest point in the 18th century. At times, there were fewer than 40,000 people on the island. Danish officials seriously discussed evacuating the entire population to Denmark and abandoning Iceland altogether, but the Icelanders stayed. They endured. They lived in turf houses, structures built from blocks of turf cut from the earth, insulated by the grass and soil, their interiors dark and smoky but warm enough to survive the winter. They ate what the land and sea provided: dried fish, fermented shark, sour butter, seaweed, the occasional sheep. They told stories. They recited poetry. They kept the language alive. It is difficult to overstate the stubbornness, the sheer quiet refusal to give up that sustained Iceland through these centuries. The country had every reason to fail. Its people had every reason to leave, but they did not. They stayed on their farms, in their valleys, on their coastlines, and they endured. The turf houses that Icelanders lived in during these centuries deserve a moment of attention, for they were not merely shelter. They were an expression of the relationship between people and land. A traditional Icelandic turf house was built by cutting blocks of turf, living grass, and its root mat, plus the earth beneath, and stacking them into thick walls. The roof was also turf, laid over a timber frame. From a distance, a turf house was nearly invisible, a grassy mound with a door, blending into the hillside as if the land itself had decided to shelter the people who lived on it. Inside, the rooms were low-ceilinged and dark. The main room, the bathstoffa, served as bedroom, living room, and workroom for the entire household. Family members and servants slept side by side on a raised platform along the walls, sharing warmth. In the long winter evenings, someone would read aloud from the sagas or recite poetry while others worked, spinning wool, knitting, carving, mending. This tradition of kvöldvaka, evening waking, kept the literary culture alive through centuries when books were rare and expensive. The turf house was cold, smoky, and cramped by modern standards, but it worked. It insulated against the fierce Icelandic wind, retained heat from the hearth and from the bodies of its inhabitants, and it could be built from materials that were freely available on any Icelandic farm. When a turf house eventually deteriorated, as they all did within a generation or two, It returned to the earth from which it was made, and a new one was built in its place. The last turf houses were inhabited into the mid-20th century. Today, a handful are preserved as museums, and they stand as quiet monuments to a way of life that demanded everything and offered, in return, survival and the warmth of shared stories in the dark. The hardship of these centuries drove waves of emigration. The largest came in the late 19th century, when thousands of Icelanders, pushed by volcanic disaster, poverty, and a sense that the island could no longer sustain its population, left for North America. Between 1870 and 1914, roughly 15 to 20,000 Icelanders emigrated, a staggering proportion for a country whose total population was only about 70,000. They settled primarily in Manitoba, Canada, founding a community called Gimli on the shores of Lake Winnipeg, a place they named New Iceland. They brought their language, their sagas, their traditions of literacy and self-governance. They published Icelandic language newspapers. They built churches and schools. They named their children with Icelandic names and told them the stories of the old country. Today, the descendants of these emigrants, Western Icelanders as they are sometimes called, number over 100,000. Many have visited Iceland, traced their ancestry, reconnected with distant relatives. The emigration, which seemed at the time like a loss, a failure of the homeland to sustain its people, has become, over the generations, a thread connecting Iceland to a diaspora that keeps its culture alive in new soil. In Gimli, Manitoba, an annual festival called Icelandingdagurinn, Icelanders' Day, has been held every August since 1890. It is the largest Icelandic festival outside Iceland, complete with Viking reenactments, Icelandic food, poetry readings, and the election of a fjallkona, maid of the mountain, a symbolic figure representing Iceland herself. The festival draws thousands of attendees, many of them descendants of the original settlers, some speaking fragments of Icelandic learned from grandparents who carried the language across the ocean over a century ago. The connection between Iceland and its diaspora is a reminder that identity, like the Icelandic language, can be remarkably persistent. The emigrants who left in the 1880s did not stop being Icelandic. Their children grew up hearing the sagas. Their grandchildren learned to make kleiner and vinaterta. And now, 140 years later, people in Winnipeg and Seattle and Fargo still identify, in some quiet but real way, as Icelandic. The thread stretches thin across the Atlantic and across the generations, but it does not break. There is a man worth knowing in this context, Stephen G. Stephenson, an Icelandic Canadian poet who emigrated to Alberta in 1889 and became one of the finest poets to write in the Icelandic language, despite spending most of his life on a Canadian farm. He wrote about the old country with a longing that was not sentimental but deeply felt, the longing of a man who loved one land and lived in another, and who carried both of them inside him for the rest of his life. His poetry is read in Iceland today alongside the sagas and the Eddas, a voice from the diaspora that became part of the homeland's literary tradition. It is a beautiful irony. One of Iceland's greatest poets never returned to Iceland. He found the words for his homeland by standing far enough away to see it whole. Independence and modern Iceland, the road from centuries of Danish rule to full independence was long, but the Icelanders walked it with characteristic determination. The independence movement gathered strength in the 19th century, inspired in part by the broader wave of nationalism sweeping Europe. Hon Sigurdsson, a scholar and politician who spent much of his career in Copenhagen, became the leading voice for Icelandic sovereignty. He argued, persuasively and persistently, that Iceland's ancient tradition of self-governance, the Althing, the legal code, the entire structure of the Commonwealth, gave it a historical and moral claim to independence that could not be denied. Progress came in stages. In 1874, Denmark granted Iceland a constitution and limited home rule. In 1904, Iceland received further autonomy with its own minister in Reykjavik. In 1918, Iceland became a sovereign kingdom in personal union with Denmark, sharing a king but governing its own affairs. Full independence would have to wait for a moment when Denmark was too distracted to object. That moment came with the Second World War. When Nazi Germany occupied Denmark in April 1940, Iceland was suddenly cut off from its nominal sovereign. The British, fearing that Germany might use Iceland as a base for Atlantic operations, occupied the island in May 1940, without resistance but also without invitation. The following year, American forces replaced the British, and Iceland became a significant Allied base for the Battle of the Atlantic. The American presence transformed Iceland in ways both welcome and uncomfortable. The troops brought money, jobs, and infrastructure. They built Keflavik Airport, which remains Iceland's international gateway to this day. But they also brought social disruption, and the presence of foreign soldiers on Icelandic soil was a sensitive and sometimes contentious issue. On June 17, 1944, while Denmark was still under German occupation, Icelanders voted in a referendum on full independence. The result was overwhelming. 97% voted yes. The Republic of Iceland was formally established at Þingvellir on a rainy afternoon, closing a circle that had begun at the same site over 1,000 years earlier when the first Althing convened. The decades after independence saw Iceland transform with remarkable speed. The fishing industry, which had always been the backbone of the economy, modernized and expanded. The American military presence at Keflavik brought investment and Cold War strategic importance. Reykjavik grew from a town into a proper capital city. Iceland's most dramatic assertion of sovereignty came in a series of disputes with Britain known as the Cod Wars. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, Iceland repeatedly extended its exclusive fishing zone, first to 4 nautical miles, then 12, then 50, and finally 200. Britain, whose trawler fleets had fished Icelandic waters for decades, objected strenuously. The disputes involved real naval confrontations. Icelandic Coast Guard vessels cut the trawl wires of British fishing boats, and the Royal Navy sent frigates to protect its trawlers. It was, in a sense, an absurd conflict. A tiny nation of 200,000 people facing down one of the world's great naval powers over fish. But Iceland won every round. The fishing grounds were vital to Iceland's economy and survival in a way they simply were not for Britain, and Iceland was willing to escalate, including threatening to leave NATO, in ways that forced its larger opponent to back down. The Cod Wars established the principle, now enshrined in international law, that coastal nations have exclusive economic rights to the waters around them. Modern Iceland is, by most measures, one of the most successful societies on Earth. It consistently ranks among the top countries in the world for quality of life, happiness, gender equality, safety, and education. It has no military. Its police do not carry guns. Its crime rate is among the lowest in the world. But Iceland's modern history is not without upheaval. In 2008, the country's banking system, which had expanded recklessly during a decade of deregulation and easy credit, collapsed spectacularly. Iceland's 3 major banks failed within days of each other, and the country's economy cratered. The currency lost half its value. Unemployment soared. Icelanders who had taken out loans denominated in foreign currencies found themselves owing double what they had borrowed. The crisis provoked a period of intense national soul-searching. Protests erupted in Reykjavik, the Pots and Pans Revolution, in which thousands of people gathered outside the parliament building, banging cookware and demanding accountability. The government fell. Bank executives were prosecuted and, in several cases, jailed, a response notably different from the treatment of bankers in most other countries affected by the global financial crisis. Iceland recovered, slowly and painfully, but it recovered. The fishing industry, tourism, and a growing creative economy pulled the country back. By the mid-2010s, Iceland was growing faster than most European economies, and tourism had become its largest industry, surpassing even fishing. The crisis left scars, but it also reinforced something essential about the Icelandic character: a willingness to face failure honestly, to hold powerful people accountable, and to rebuild without pretending that nothing went wrong. The rise of tourism in the years following the financial crisis has been both a salvation and a challenge. Before the crisis, Iceland received roughly 500,000 tourists per year. By 2018, that number had grown to over 2 million, more than 5 times the country's entire population. The surge was driven by several factors. The weak post-crisis currency made Iceland affordable for foreign visitors. Social media spread images of Iceland's otherworldly landscapes to a global audience. And airline competition, particularly from low-cost carriers offering cheap transatlantic stopovers, made the country accessible in a way it had never been before. The economic benefits were enormous. Tourism revenue replaced some of what was lost when the banking sector collapsed, creating jobs, supporting communities, and funding infrastructure. But the pressures were equally significant. Popular sites became crowded. Fragile landscapes, the mossy lava fields, the highland trails, the thermal areas showed signs of damage from the sheer volume of foot traffic. Roads and facilities built for a population of 380,000 struggled to accommodate millions of visitors. Iceland's response has been characteristically pragmatic. Visitor fees at popular sites, investment in infrastructure, seasonal pricing to encourage off-peak travel, and ongoing public conversation about how much tourism is too much. The Icelanders want visitors. They want to share their extraordinary country with the world. But they also want to protect it, to ensure that the landscapes that draw people here in the first place are not destroyed by the weight of their admiration. It is a balancing act, and one that Iceland is still learning to perform. But if any country is equipped to manage the tension between openness and preservation, it is this one, a society that has spent 1,000 years learning to live with forces it cannot fully control. Daily life in the land of fire and ice. To understand a country, you must step inside its daily rhythms, not the grand landscapes or the dramatic history, but the small, ordinary moments that make up the texture of life. Morning in Reykjavik begins quietly. The city is compact. Most of its population lives within a few square kilometers, and the streets are walkable and calm. The air, even in the city center, smells clean, faintly of the sea. In winter, the streets may be dark until nearly 11 in the morning. In summer, they may have been light all night. Icelanders are, by reputation, late risers. The workday typically begins around 9, later than in many European countries. But this is balanced by long hours when needed. Icelanders work some of the longest hours in Europe. There is a pragmatic approach to time. What matters is that the work gets done, not necessarily when you sit down to do it. Coffee is essential. Icelanders drink more coffee per capita than almost any other nation, a statistic they share with the other Nordic countries, all of which take their coffee consumption extremely seriously. The coffee in Iceland is strong and good, and it is served everywhere. At home, at work, in the gas stations that dot the ring road, in the fishing villages of the West Fjords where the nearest cafe may be hours away. Coffee breaks, kaffi, are a social institution. They are moments of pause in the day, opportunities to sit, to talk, to eat a klunur, a traditional Icelandic twisted donut, lightly sweetened, perfect for dunking. The pace of these breaks is unhurried. Conversation moves slowly, comfortably, touching on weather, news, family, the latest book. Icelanders are not given to small talk in the American sense. They do not fill silence for the sake of filling it, but among friends and family, conversation flows easily and warmly. If coffee is Iceland's social lubricant, the swimming pool is its social heart. Every town in Iceland, no matter how small, has a public swimming pool, Sundlaug, heated by geothermal water. These are not the chlorinated, institutional pools of most countries. They are warm, often outdoors, surrounded by steam, and equipped with hot tubs, called hot pots, at varying temperatures, from pleasantly warm to borderline scalding. The swimming pool is where Icelanders go to talk, not the cafe, not the bar, the pool. Business deals are discussed in hot tubs. Neighbors catch up on gossip while soaking in 40-degree water. Children learn to swim almost before they learn to walk. Teenagers hang out at the pool. Elderly couples sit in the hottest pot, their faces reddened, their conversation unhurried. For visitors, the culture of the Icelandic pool can be surprising. Showering before entering is mandatory, and the shower is communal and thorough. This is a matter of hygiene. The pools use minimal chemicals because the geothermal water is naturally clean, and keeping it that way requires that everyone washes properly before getting in. It is not optional, and pool attendants will send you back if you try to skip it. Once you are in, though, the experience is transformative. Sitting in a hot tub in Reykjavik, snow falling gently around you, steam rising into the dark winter sky, your body warm and weightless. It is easy to understand why Icelanders consider this a necessity, not a luxury. Icelandic society is remarkably egalitarian. The gap between rich and poor, while it exists, is smaller than in most Western countries. The social safety net is strong, healthcare is universal, education is free through university, and parental leave is generous. 9 months, shared between both parents, with a portion reserved specifically for fathers to encourage equal participation in child rearing. Gender equality is taken seriously and has been for a long time. Iceland was the first country in the world to democratically elect a female head of state, Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, who served as president from 1980 to 1996. It has consistently ranked first or near first in global gender equality indices. The country's approach is practical rather than ideological. Equality is simply the way things work, and the expectation is that everyone, regardless of gender, contributes, earns, and shares responsibility. Family structures are flexible by international standards. A large proportion of Icelandic children are born to unmarried parents, not because family is undervalued, but because marriage is seen as one option among many, not a prerequisite for family life. Last names follow the patronymic system. A child takes their father's first name, or, increasingly, their mother's, followed by son or dóttir. So the child of a man named Jon would be Jónsson, son, or Jónsdóttir, daughter. This is why the Icelandic phone book is organized by first name, because last names are not family names. They are simply identifiers. Icelanders have a reputation for being reserved and introverted during the week, then transforming on weekends, particularly Friday and Saturday nights, into some of the most enthusiastic socializers in Northern Europe. The Reykjavik nightlife, concentrated in a few blocks of the city center, is famously intense. People go out late, very late, often not leaving the house until midnight, and the evening builds in energy as the hours pass, peaking at 2 or 3 in the morning. This pattern, quiet restraint during the week, explosive release on the weekend, has been observed by visitors to Iceland for decades. Some attribute it to the climate and the darkness, which create a need for communal release. Others point to the small population and the tight social bonds that come with it. In a city where everyone knows everyone, the weekend is when those bonds are refreshed, tested, and renewed. Sunday morning in Reykjavik is the quiet counterpart. The streets are empty. Families eat brunch together. The swimming pools, always the pools, are busy with people soaking away the excesses of the previous night. There is a gentle, cyclical quality to the Icelandic weekend. Intensity followed by calm, noise followed by silence, gathering followed by solitude. The Icelandic sense of humor deserves mention because it shapes the social atmosphere in ways that visitors sometimes find puzzling. Icelanders are master practitioners of understatement and deadpan delivery. The humor is dry, often self-deprecating, and occasionally dark, a natural product, perhaps, of living in a country where nature regularly reminds you of your own insignificance. When the Eyjafjallajökull eruption grounded flights across Europe in 2010, many Icelanders responded with wry amusement. When foreign news anchors struggled to pronounce the volcano's name, Icelanders shared videos coaching them through the syllables with exaggerated patience. When the Fagradalsfjall eruptions drew crowds of hikers to watch lava flow, Photographs circulated of people playing volleyball and cooking hot dogs next to the eruption. The message, implicit and very Icelandic, was, "This is what we live with. We might as well enjoy it." This humor is not indifference. It is a coping mechanism refined over 1,000 years of volcanic eruptions, harsh winters, and the general absurdity of choosing to live on a volatile island in the middle of the North Atlantic. If you cannot laugh at the volcano, the darkness, and the weather, you will not last long in Iceland. Modern Iceland has become, somewhat paradoxically, both a symbol of environmental purity and a cautionary tale. The country's energy system is a model for the world, virtually 100% renewable, powered by the Earth's own heat and the force of its rivers. The air is clean, the water is pristine. The landscape, despite its volcanic character, is breathtakingly beautiful. But Iceland also bears the scars of environmental mismanagement. The deforestation that followed the settlement, the destruction of the native birch forests that once covered much of the lowlands, was an ecological disaster from which the island has never fully recovered. Soil erosion, exacerbated by overgrazing from sheep, has stripped vast areas of the highlands of whatever thin soil they once possessed, leaving behind the barren volcanic desert that covers much of the interior. Reforestation efforts have been underway for decades, and young birch and pine plantations are slowly greening some areas that have been bare for centuries. But the process is painfully slow. Trees grow slowly in Iceland's short, cool growing season, and the exposed soil blows away before roots can take hold. It took a few decades to cut down the forests. It will take centuries to bring them back. This awareness that human actions can damage a landscape for a very long time, and that repair is far harder than destruction, runs deep in modern Icelandic consciousness. It is part of the reason Iceland takes environmental issues seriously. The Icelanders have seen, in their own land, what happens when a fragile ecosystem is pushed too hard. They do not need climate models to understand environmental consequences. They have their own treeless hills as evidence. Food. From survival to celebration, the food of Iceland tells the story of a people who learned to survive on what the land and sea provided in a climate that offered little and demanded everything. For most of Iceland's history, the diet was based on a few staples: fish, lamb, dairy, and whatever could be preserved through the long, dark winter. Fresh vegetables were a luxury. The growing season was too short for most crops, and imported produce was expensive and rare. Icelanders developed preservation techniques out of necessity: drying, smoking, fermenting, pickling, salting. These methods kept food edible through months of cold and darkness, and many of them are still practiced today, not out of necessity but out of tradition and genuine affection for the flavors they produce. Harðfiskar, dried fish, usually haddock or cod, is one of Iceland's oldest and most enduring foods. The fish is wind-dried until it becomes stiff and slightly translucent, then torn into strips and eaten with butter. It is high in protein, lightweight, and virtually imperishable, the perfect food for a society that needed calories it could store and carry. The taste is mild, faintly sweet, and the texture is chewy in a satisfying way. Most Icelanders grow up eating harðfiskar as a snack, and many continue to do so throughout their lives. Lamb is the other pillar of Icelandic cuisine. Icelandic sheep are descended from the animals brought by the original settlers over 1,000 years ago, and because Iceland has been isolated from other sheep populations for so long, the breed has remained remarkably pure. The sheep roam freely in the highlands during summer, grazing on wild grass, thyme, and moss, which gives the meat a distinctive, slightly gamey flavor that is prized by chefs and home cooks alike. In autumn, the sheep are rounded up. The retia, or sheep roundup, is one of Iceland's most important communal traditions. Farmers and their families ride into the highlands on horseback, gathering the sheep that have scattered across the mountains during the summer and herding them back down to the lowlands. The roundup is hard work, but it is also a celebration. Communities come together, songs are sung, stories are told, and the end of the roundup is marked by feasting and dancing. The most adventurous aspect of Icelandic food tradition is Þorrablót, a midwinter feast held in late January or February, drawing on the oldest preserved foods of Iceland. The spread at a Þorrablót table can be startling to the uninitiated. Svæð, singed sheep's head split in two, stares up from the plate with an expression that is best described as resigned. The meat is tender and flavorful, particularly the cheeks, but the presentation takes some getting used to. Slátur, literally slaughter, refers to two types of traditional sausage: blóðmör, a blood pudding similar to black pudding, and lifrapilsa, a liver sausage. Both are boiled and served in slices. They are richer than they sound, and most Icelanders consider them comfort food. And then there is hakkarl, fermented shark. This is the dish that Iceland is most notorious for, and the one that provokes the strongest reactions from visitors. Greenland shark is buried in gravel and left to ferment for several months, then hung in a drying shed for another few months. The result is a pungent, ammonia-scented delicacy that tastes and smells like nothing else on earth. The traditional way to eat hakkarl is in small cubes, chased immediately with a shot of brennivin, Iceland's signature spirit, a caraway-flavored schnapps, sometimes called Black Death. The brennivin cuts the ammonia, and the combination is, if not exactly pleasant, then at least survivable. Most Icelanders eat hakkarl at Þorrablót as a matter of tradition and pride, not because they particularly enjoy it. Visitors who try it earn a certain grudging respect. But Icelandic food is not all fermented shark and sheep's heads. The modern food scene in Reykjavik is vibrant, creative, and surprisingly sophisticated for a city of its size. New Nordic cuisine, the movement that put Scandinavian cooking on the global culinary map, has found fertile ground in Iceland. Chefs work with the extraordinary local ingredients: wild Arctic char, langoustine from the cold North Atlantic waters, lamb from the highlands, wild herbs and mosses foraged from the landscape, dairy products of exceptional quality. The results are dishes that honor traditional ingredients while presenting them in entirely new ways. Sky, a thick, creamy dairy product that has been made in Iceland for over 1,000 years, deserves special mention. Technically a fresh cheese rather than a yogurt, Skyr is high in protein, low in fat, and has a clean, slightly tart flavor. It was a staple of the Icelandic diet for centuries, eaten plain or with cream and sugar. In recent years, it has been discovered by the global health food market and is now available in supermarkets worldwide, though Icelanders will tell you, correctly, that the mass-produced versions bear little resemblance to the real thing made in small Icelandic dairies. And then there is the Icelandic hot dog. This might be the country's most beloved food, a simple, unpretentious lamb hot dog served in a steamed bun with raw onion, crispy fried onion, ketchup, sweet mustard, and a creamy remoulade sauce. The most famous hot dog stand in the country is Bæjarins Bestu Pulsur, a tiny stall near the harbor in Reykjavik that has been serving hot dogs since 1937. Former presidents, rock stars, and ordinary Icelanders have stood in line at this stall, waiting for the same simple, perfect hot dog. When you order, the proper thing to say is "Eina með öllu," one with everything. One of Iceland's most charming culinary traditions is the baking of rúgbrauð, a dark, dense, slightly sweet rye bread that is, in some parts of the country, still baked underground using geothermal heat. The process is simple and ancient. The dough is placed in a sealed pot. The pot is buried in a hole near a hot spring or geothermal vent, and the heat of the earth bakes the bread slowly over 24 hours. The result is a moist, almost cake-like loaf with a deep caramelized sweetness, nothing like the dry rye bread of continental Europe. Near Lake Mývatn in the north, at a place called the Cow Spring, Kúafur, you can still find rúgbrauð baked in this way. The bakery is quite literally a hole in the ground, marked by a small sign where pots of bread dough are buried each morning, and dug up the following day. The bread is served warm, sliced thick, with a generous spread of Icelandic butter. It is one of those foods that connects the eater directly to the landscape. You are eating bread baked by the same geothermal forces that built the island. The quality of Icelandic dairy products is something that visitors often remark upon, and it is not an accident. Icelandic cattle, like Icelandic sheep and Icelandic horses, are a breed that has been isolated on the island for over 1,000 years. They are hardy, well adapted to the climate, and they produce milk of exceptional richness. The butter in particular is remarkable. Yellow, creamy, and deeply flavored, the color coming from the beta-carotene in the grass the cattle eat. Spread on warm rugbrauð, Icelandic butter is one of the simplest and most satisfying foods imaginable. The tradition of foraging runs deep in Icelandic food culture. Beyond the farmed and fished staples, Icelanders have long supplemented their diet with what the landscape provides. Seaweed, particularly dulse, known as sole, has been gathered from the shoreline for centuries and eaten dried, often with butter. Wild berries, bilberries, crowberries, and the occasional wild strawberry ripen briefly in late summer and are gathered by families who know the best picking spots and guard the knowledge like heirlooms. Wild thyme, angelica, and Arctic thyme grow across the lowlands and have been used for flavoring, medicine, and tea for as long as people have lived on the island. In some coastal areas, seabird eggs, particularly guillemot and fulmar eggs, were historically collected from cliff nests in a practice that required extraordinary skill and courage. Egg collectors would lower themselves on ropes down the faces of 100-meter sea cliffs, gathering eggs from narrow ledges while waves crashed far below. The tradition has largely died out, both because of conservation concerns and because the risk no longer justifies the reward when eggs can be bought at the store. But the memory of the cliff egg gatherers persists in Icelandic culture as a symbol of the lengths to which people went to feed their families in a land that demanded ingenuity and nerve. Icelandic cream romi is thick enough to stand a spoon in, and it appears in every part of the cuisine, dolloped on sky, whipped over cakes, stirred into sauces, poured over berries. There is a dish called hreingor, a simple mixture of scoyr and cream, sometimes with sugar, that Icelanders have eaten for centuries. It is the kind of food that seems too basic to be worth mentioning until you taste it and realize that when the ingredients are this good, simplicity is not a limitation, it is the point. Language, literature, and the power of stories. The Icelandic language is a living treasure, one of the oldest languages in continuous use in Europe, preserved with a deliberateness that borders on devotion. Modern Icelandic is remarkably close to Old Norse, the language spoken by the Vikings and the settlers who arrived in Iceland over 1,000 years ago, while the other Scandinavian languages, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, evolved dramatically over the centuries, simplifying their grammar, absorbing loanwords from German, English, and French. Icelandic remained largely unchanged. An Icelandic schoolchild today can, with some effort, read the original manuscripts of the sagas written in the 13th century. No English speaker could come close to reading Chaucer's original Middle English with the same ease, let alone anything older. This preservation is not accidental. It is the result of a conscious, centuries-long effort to keep the language pure. Iceland has an official language committee, the Íslensk málnefnd, that creates new Icelandic words for modern concepts rather than adopting foreign terms. Where other languages simply borrowed the word computer, Icelandic coined tölva, a blend of the words for number and prophetess. A telephone is a simi, from an old word for thread or connection. A helicopter is a theala, from the verb meaning to whirl. This linguistic conservatism is not mere stubbornness. For Icelanders, the language is inseparable from national identity. During the centuries of Danish rule, when Icelandic political independence was lost, the language became the vessel that carried the culture forward. The sagas, the poetry, the laws, All were in Icelandic. To lose the language would have been to lose the connection to everything that made Iceland, Iceland. The result is a nation of readers. Iceland publishes more books per capita than any other country, and Icelanders actually read them. During the Jólabókaflóð, the Christmas book flood, publishers release the majority of their annual titles in the weeks before Christmas. Books are the most popular Christmas gift. On Christmas Eve, after gifts are exchanged, Icelanders traditionally spend the evening reading their new books, often with chocolate and a warm drink. This is not a quaint tradition in decline. It is alive and thriving. Bookstores in Reykjavik are busy, well-stocked, and culturally central. Literary festivals draw large audiences. Debut novels are discussed on the radio. Poetry, a form that has struggled commercially in most countries, remains vital in Iceland. Poets are respected figures. Verses are quoted in conversation. The rhythms of the language lend themselves to poetry in a way that even non-Icelandic speakers can feel when they hear the words spoken aloud. The preservation of language extends to personal names. Iceland has a personal names committee that maintains a register of approved Icelandic names. Parents who wish to give their child a name not on the list must apply for approval. The committee evaluates names based on several criteria. The name must be compatible with Icelandic grammatical traditions. It must be declinable, meaning it must work within the language's case system, and it must not cause the bearer embarrassment. This strikes many outsiders as overly controlling, and it has generated occasional controversy. But the system reflects a deeper principle, that names, like words, are part of the shared language, and that the language belongs to everyone, not just to the individual. In a country of fewer than 400,000 people, where nearly everyone is distantly related, there is a famous app, the Icelandic, that allows Icelanders to check their degree of kinship before dating. Names carry weight. They connect people to their ancestors, to the sagas, to the long chain of Icelandic identity. The Icelandic relationship with stories goes beyond literature. It is woven into the way people talk, the way they relate to place, the way they understand their own lives. Iceland is a country where every mountain, every rock formation, every stretch of coast has a story attached to it, a saga episode, a local legend, a tale of hidden people or trolls turned to stone by sunlight. These stories are not relics of the past. They are part of the living landscape. When Icelanders plan a road or a building project, they occasionally consult with people who claim to know the locations of Alagabletia, enchanted spots, places where hidden people live. This is not taken entirely seriously by everyone, but it is not dismissed either. There is a characteristically Icelandic pragmatism at work. Why take the risk of offending forces you cannot see when it costs nothing to move the road a few meters? The Icelandic word for this attitude might be trúa, which translates roughly as belief, but carries a nuance that is closer to not ruling it out. When surveys ask Icelanders whether they believe in elves and hidden people, a surprisingly large percentage, often cited as over 50%, say they do not deny their existence. This is not the same as believing. It is something more subtle, a willingness to hold space for mystery, to acknowledge that the world may contain more than what can be measured and mapped. In a country where the earth opens without warning, where the sky lights up with unexplained color, and where the weather changes faster than you can react, this seems less like superstition and more like wisdom. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the place of poetry in Icelandic life, because it is unlike anything found in most modern societies. In Iceland, poetry is not a marginal art form appreciated by a small literary elite. It is woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that can surprise visitors. Icelanders compose verses for birthdays, retirements, weddings, and funerals. Newspapers print poems. Radio stations broadcast them. When someone achieves something notable, or when something amusing happens in public life, it is not unusual for commemorative verses to circulate, often anonymous, often wickedly funny. This is a direct inheritance from the saga tradition, in which poetry was a form of social currency. In the sagas, the ability to compose a good verse on the spot, a laza visa or loose verse, was a mark of intelligence and social standing. Saga characters compose poetry in moments of crisis, triumph, and grief. Egil Skallagrimsson, the great warrior poet, composed his finest work, Sonnet to Wreck, Loss of Sons, after the drowning of his son. It is one of the most devastating expressions of grief in all of literature, and it was composed not by a professional poet but by a farmer chieftain who happened to have a gift for words. Modern Iceland has maintained this tradition of poetry as a living social art. The country has a thriving poetry scene, readings, festivals, publications, but more importantly, poetry has not been confined to the scene. It lives in the culture at large, in the way people speak, in the value they place on well-chosen words. In a country where everyone reads, and where the language itself has been preserved with such care, poetry is not an ornament. It is a fundamental form of expression. Music, art, and the creative spirit. For a country of fewer than 400,000 people, Iceland produces an almost absurd amount of creative output. In music alone, the list is remarkable. Iceland has given the world artists and bands that have achieved global recognition far out of proportion to the country's size. The Sugar Cubes, Sigur Rós, of Monsters and Men, Aske, Kaleo, Guskus, each distinctly Icelandic, each shaped by the landscape and culture of the island, each finding audiences that would have seemed impossible for musicians from a country with the population of a mid-sized American suburb. The most internationally famous of all Icelandic musicians needs no surname. She has been a fixture of global music for over 3 decades, constantly reinventing herself, blending electronic music with avant-garde art, nature, and a voice that seems to come from somewhere other than a human body. She has sold millions of records, won countless awards, and remains, for many people around the world, the first and only thing they associate with Iceland. Reykjavik's music scene is concentrated, intense, and remarkably accessible. On any given weekend, dozens of bands and musicians play in the city's bars, clubs, and concert halls. The scene is egalitarian. It is not unusual to see a musician who has sold records around the world playing a casual set in a bar that holds 50 people. The Harpa Concert Hall, which opened in 2011 on the Reykjavik waterfront, is one of the most striking buildings in Northern Europe. Its facade is a honeycomb of colored glass panels designed by the artist Ólafur Eliasson, and it catches and fragments the light, the low Arctic sun, the northern lights, the glow of the city, in endlessly changing patterns. Inside, it houses the Icelandic Symphony Orchestra, the Icelandic Opera, and a variety of concert spaces. But Harpa, beautiful as it is not the heart of Reykjavik's music scene. The heart is in the small venues, the basement bars, the house concerts, and the impromptu performances that happen when musicians, who all know each other because everyone in Iceland knows everyone, decide to play together on a Thursday night for no particular reason. The visual arts in Iceland are similarly vibrant. The landscape itself is the country's greatest artwork, and Icelandic artists have long drawn on it, not just as subject matter, but as material, canvas, and collaborator. Land art installations dot the remote countryside. Sculptors work with basalt, driftwood, and volcanic glass. Painters capture the light, that extraordinary, ever-changing Icelandic light, in ways that make the landscape feel both real and dreamlike. The boundary between art and nature in Iceland is permeable. Reykjavik itself is a canvas. The city's buildings are painted in bright colors: red, yellow, blue, green, a deliberate choice to bring warmth and cheer to a place where the sky is often gray. Street art covers walls and fences. Design is taken seriously. From the typography of street signs to the architecture of public buildings, there is an attention to aesthetics that reflects a society that values beauty as something ordinary, not extraordinary. Not a luxury, but a necessity. Iceland's landscapes have become a magnet for international film and television production. The otherworldly terrain has stood in for alien planets, frozen wastelands, mythical kingdoms, and prehistoric Earth. The revenue from film production has become a significant part of the economy, and Iceland has developed a skilled local crew industry to support it. The musical traditions of Iceland reach far deeper than the global pop and rock that has brought international attention. The oldest Icelandic musical form is the rimmer, a tradition of chanted narrative poetry that dates back to the 14th century. Rimo are long, metrically complex poems performed in a distinctive chanting style that sounds, to unfamiliar ears, somewhere between singing and recitation. They were the entertainment of the Kvöldvaka, the winter evening gatherings in the Bathstofa, and they kept the tradition of poetic composition alive through the centuries of hardship. The rimmer tradition nearly died out in the 20th century, overtaken by newer forms of entertainment. But in recent decades, it has experienced a revival, with young Icelanders rediscovering the form and adapting it to contemporary settings. There is something deeply satisfying about rimur: the rhythmic complexity, the virtuosity of the performance, the way the words flow in patterns that the listener can feel even without understanding every word. Church music in Iceland has its own distinctive character. The old churches, small, often wooden, set in remote and beautiful locations, have acoustics that lend themselves to a particular kind of singing: sparse, reverberant, deeply emotional. Hymn singing in these spaces is one of Iceland's most moving musical experiences. The sound fills the small room entirely, the notes hanging in the air, the wood of the building seeming to absorb and then release the music. But the creative energy that matters most to Icelanders is their own. The country produces filmmakers, novelists, poets, musicians, designers, and artists at a rate that defies its size. There is a theory, not proven, but intuitively appealing, that Iceland's long, dark winters are partly responsible. When you are confined indoors for months, when the world outside is dark and cold, you create, you write, you compose, you make things. The darkness, paradoxically, produces light, the light of stories, songs, and art that would not exist without the long winter that demanded their creation. There is also the matter of scale. In a country of fewer than 400,000 people, the barrier between audience and creator is almost non-existent. Everyone knows someone who writes, who plays music, who paints. Creative expression is not something that happens in a distant capital, performed by professionals for passive consumers. It is something that happens in your living room, at your friend's gallery opening, at the bar down the street where a band you know is playing a set. This intimacy breeds ambition. If you grow up in a culture where making art is normal, where everyone around you is writing, playing, creating, then making art does not feel like an unusual or risky choice. It feels like something people do. And the smallness of the community means that talent, when it appears, is noticed quickly and supported readily. Iceland's outsized creative output is not a mystery. It is the natural product of a culture that values making things, that has long, dark winters in which to make them, and that is small enough for every voice to be heard. Hidden corners. Now let us wander into the corners of Iceland that surprise even those who think they know the island well. The Icelandic horse is unlike any other horse in the world. Brought to Iceland by the Norse settlers over 1,000 years ago, the breed has been completely isolated ever since. No horses have been imported to Iceland since the 10th century, and an Icelandic horse that leaves the country can never return. This has kept the breed pure but also vulnerable to diseases that other horse populations have developed resistance to. Icelandic horses are small, technically pony-sized, though calling one a pony in front of an Icelander is considered poor form. They are sturdy, sure-footed, and exceptionally good-natured. Most distinctively, they possess two gaits that other horse breeds lack. The tolt, a smooth 4-beat gait that allows the rider to cover ground quickly without bouncing, and the flying pace, a fast lateral gait used for short-distance racing. The tolt is what makes the Icelandic horse special for riders. It is so smooth that a common demonstration involves a rider holding a full glass of beer while the horse tolts at speed. the beer does not spill. For centuries, the tolt was a practical necessity. It allowed Icelanders to cover long distances on horseback across rough terrain without being exhausted by the jarring trot of other breeds. We have already touched on the Icelandic naming system, but it deserves a closer look in the hidden corners of Icelandic life. Because Icelanders do not have family surnames in the traditional sense, they address each other by first name in virtually all contexts. The president is called by their first name. Doctors, teachers, and business leaders are addressed by their first names. The phone book, though increasingly obsolete, lists people alphabetically by first name, not last. If you are looking for John Sigurðsson, you look under J, not S. This creates a sense of informality and equality that pervades Icelandic society. There is no linguistic mechanism for deference, no equivalent of Mr. or Mrs. that is commonly used. You are simply you, known by the name your parents gave you, and that is sufficient. The kinship app, Icelandingabók, is one of Iceland's most charming and practical innovations. Because the population is so small and so many Icelanders are distantly related, the app allows users to check their degree of kinship with another person. It was originally created as a genealogical database, but it gained fame for its usefulness in the dating scene. The joke, which is not entirely a joke, is that Icelanders bump phones before a date to make sure they are not too closely related. The hidden people, Huldufolk, occupy a unique place in Icelandic culture. They are not quite believed in, not quite disbelieved. They are, in the Icelandic imagination, a parallel population living in the rocks, hills, and cliffs of the landscape, invisible to most humans but occasionally making their presence known. Stories of the hidden people are not confined to ancient folklore. Construction projects in Iceland have been delayed or rerouted when workers reported equipment breakdowns, accidents, or persistent bad luck that locals attributed to disturbing Huldufolk habitations. In 2013, a road project in the Álftanes area near Reykjavik was halted after protests from people who believed the planned route would destroy an elf church, a large rock formation said to be a sacred site for the hidden people. The road was eventually rerouted. Whether this reflects genuine belief, cultural tradition, environmental consciousness dressed in folklore, or simply a characteristic Icelandic reluctance to dismiss what cannot be disproven, is a matter of interpretation. What is certain is that the hidden people remain part of the cultural conversation in Iceland in a way that would be difficult to imagine in most modern European countries. We have mentioned the Jólabókaflóð, the Christmas book flood, but its scale and significance deserve a closer look. Each year, beginning in November, Icelandic publishers release the bulk of their annual output in a concentrated rush. A catalogue called the Bókatidindi, essentially a comprehensive listing of every book published that season, is distributed to every household in the country, and families browse it together, circling titles they want to give and receive. The result is that Christmas Eve in Iceland is for many families a night of reading. After the evening meal and the exchange of gifts, which traditionally takes place on the evening of December 24th, families settle in with their new books, hot chocolate, and perhaps a plate of laufabrauð, the traditional thin, decorated leaf bread that is fried until crisp and golden. This tradition is not ancient. It dates back to the Second World War, when wartime restrictions limited the availability of most luxury goods but not paper, making books one of the few gifts that could be produced domestically. But it has become so central to Icelandic Christmas that it feels timeless, and it serves as a vivid illustration of a culture that places stories at the center of its identity. Iceland is full of small, surprising facts that defy expectations. There are no mosquitoes in Iceland. Despite being home to midges, flies, and various other insects, the island has never had a mosquito population. Scientists believe that the rapid temperature fluctuations in Icelandic weather disrupt the mosquito breeding cycle. The thaw-freeze-thaw pattern of Icelandic springs does not allow the larvae to complete their development. For a country with so much standing water, this absence is remarkable and deeply appreciated. Iceland has no railway. It is one of the few European countries, and one of the few developed nations anywhere, without any form of rail transport. The population is too small and too spread out along the coast to make a railway economically viable, and the volcanic landscape makes construction challenging. Icelanders drive, and they drive long distances on the single road, Route 1, the ring road, that circles the island. Beer was illegal in Iceland until 1989. A prohibition on beer had been in place since 1915, and while wine and spirits were legalized in 1935, beer, considered more likely to encourage drinking among young people, remained banned until March 1, 1989. That date is now celebrated annually as Bjórdagurinn, Beer Day, with enthusiasm and a certain amount of excess. The country has no standing army and has not had one since the settlement era. Iceland's defense was provided by the United States under a bilateral agreement from 1951 to 2006, when American forces withdrew. Today, Iceland has a coast guard, a police force, and a small crisis response unit, but no military in any traditional sense. It is, by most measures, one of the most peaceful countries on Earth. Perhaps the most hidden corner of Iceland is not a place, but a quality. It's silence. In the highlands, away from roads and towns, the silence is extraordinary. There is no traffic noise, no construction, no aircraft, no human sound at all. In calm weather, the silence is so complete that it becomes a presence. You become aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the sound of your feet on the gravel. This silence is increasingly rare in the modern world. Most of us live immersed in a constant background of noise, so constant that we no longer notice it until it is absent. In the Icelandic highlands, its absence is startling. You find yourself listening, straining to hear something, anything, and then you stop straining, and you simply stand there in the silence, and something in you relaxes. The Icelandic word for this quality might be ró, peace, tranquility, calm. It is not emptiness, it is fullness, the fullness of a landscape so vast and so still that it absorbs everything, including you. The ring road, Route 1, is Iceland's circulatory system. This single road circles the entire island, connecting the coastal towns and villages, passing through some of the most spectacular scenery in Europe, and serving as the only major highway in the country. It is roughly 1,320 kilometers long, and driving it without stops takes about 16 hours, though no one drives it without stops. The ring road was not completed until 1974. Before that, parts of the country, particularly the east and the west fords, were effectively cut off from the rest of the island during winter. The completion of the road was a milestone in Icelandic national life, connecting communities that had been isolated for centuries and making it possible, for the first time, to drive around the entire island. Today, the ring road trip is one of the great road journeys of the world. The landscape changes constantly, from the lush, green farmlands of the south to the stark lava deserts of the east, from the deep fjords of the north to the wide, flat sand-ore plains of the southeast. Every few kilometers, a new waterfall, a new mountain, a new view that makes you pull over and simply look. We have mentioned the sheep roundup in passing, but it deserves a closer look, for it is one of the most distinctively Icelandic traditions still practiced today. Each spring, Icelandic sheep are released into the highlands to graze freely through the summer. They scatter across vast areas of mountain and moorland, fattening on the wild grasses, herbs, and moss that grow in the brief subarctic summer. They are not fenced. They are not supervised. They simply roam. In September, the retia begins. Farmers, their families, and volunteers ride into the highlands on horseback, spreading out across the mountains to find and gather the sheep. The roundup can take days, covering difficult terrain in unpredictable weather. It is physically demanding work, but it is also social. Groups ride together, share food and stories, and there is a festive communal spirit to the endeavor. Once the sheep are brought down from the highlands, they are sorted in a rett, a large circular pen divided into pie-shaped sections, one for each farm. Each sheep is identified by the unique ear tag pattern of its owner and directed into the correct section. The sorting is noisy, chaotic, and efficient, and it is followed by celebrations, feasting, drinking, and often dancing that continues late into the night. The retir is not merely a farming task. It is one of the last communal rituals that connects modern Icelanders to the rhythms of their ancestors, a tradition that has been practiced in essentially the same way for over 1,000 years. One of the hidden challenges facing Iceland today is the survival of the Icelandic language in the digital age. With fewer than 400,000 speakers, Icelandic is classified as a language with limited digital support. Voice recognition systems, AI assistants, and automated translation services often struggle with Icelandic, and many digital platforms are simply not available in the language. This creates a quiet pressure on Icelanders, particularly young people, to default to English for digital communication, social media, and entertainment. The concern is not that Icelandic will disappear overnight, but that it will gradually retreat from the spaces where modern life happens, becoming a language of home and heritage rather than a language of work, technology, and daily engagement. Iceland has responded with characteristic determination. Government-funded programs are developing Icelandic language technology, voice recognition, text-to-speech, machine translation, to ensure that the language can function in the digital world. Schools emphasize Icelandic literacy. The naming committee and language committee continue their work. The message, consistent across generations, is clear. This language is ours, and we will not let it go. The sea has always been Iceland's other landscape, as vast, as powerful, and as central to Icelandic identity as the land itself. For most of the country's history, the sea was the primary source of food. Fish, especially cod, was the basis of the economy, the currency of trade, and the protein that kept Icelanders alive through the long winters when the land produced nothing. The sea was also the great danger. Icelandic fishing was, for centuries, conducted in open rowboats, small, fragile vessels that ventured into some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The death toll was appalling. Storms could arise without warning, and boats that were swamped or overturned in the freezing North Atlantic left no survivors. Every coastal village in Iceland has its stories of boats lost, of crews that never returned, of women who stood on the shore and watched the horizon, waiting. The names of the dead were remembered. In many churches along the Icelandic coast, plaques list the names of local fishermen lost at sea, long columns of names spanning centuries, a quiet record of the price that the sea extracted for its bounty. These plaques are among the most moving things you can see in Iceland. They are not monuments to heroes or generals. They are memorials to ordinary people who went to work and did not come home. Today, Icelandic fishing is conducted with modern trawlers, sonar, and GPS, incomparably safer than the open rowboats of the past. But the sea has not changed. It is still cold, still powerful, still capable of killing, and the respect that Icelanders hold for it, the deep, unsentimental awareness of its danger, has not diminished. Closing, and so, as the night deepens and the world turns quietly on, we leave Iceland behind, for now, an island of fire and ice, of silence and stories, of people who chose to live in one of the most demanding landscapes on Earth, and built, against all odds, one of the most remarkable societies the world has ever known, a place where the Earth is still young, still restless, still making itself, where glaciers hold the memory of centuries in their blue ice, where the sky, on the darkest winter nights, comes alive with light that no human hand created, where the language spoken today is the same language in which the sagas were written, and where the stories of 1,000 years ago are not history but inheritance, a place where people gather in warm water while the wind howls outside, where children rescue lost pufflings and carry them to the sea, where the phone book is organized by first name because everyone is, in some sense, family, where the silence of the highlands is so deep that it becomes a kind of music, and where the word for peace, ro, carries the weight of 1,000 years of learning to be still. Perhaps one day you will stand on a cliff above the Atlantic, the wind in your face, and look out at a horizon that stretches forever. Perhaps you will drive the ring road as the light changes from gold to rose to the pale blue of an Icelandic twilight. Perhaps you will soak in a hot spring while snow falls silently around you, the water warm, the sky cold, the world in perfect balance. Perhaps you will sit in a cafe in Reykjavik, drinking strong coffee, listening to the rain on the window, reading a book that was written on this island, about this island, in a language that has not changed in 1,000 years. But for tonight, let its story carry you gently into rest. Somewhere tonight, a farmer in the north is checking on the sheep one last time before bed, the flashlight cutting through the darkness, the stars above sharp and clear. Somewhere, a hot spring is steaming quietly in an empty valley, its warmth rising into the cold air, unseen by anyone. Somewhere, the glacier is creaking, shifting, settling, the slow, patient sound of ice that has been here for centuries and will be here, in one form or another, for centuries more. The wind is quieting now. The northern lights are fading from the sky. The glaciers are still. The volcanoes sleep. And in a small house, in a village by the sea, someone has put down their book and turned off the light. The wind moves gently against the windows. The darkness, so familiar, so deep, wraps around the house like a blanket. Sleep well. The Atlas will be here when you return.